If you're feeling sick in Tudor England, first, condolences. Second, prepare to put your life in the hands of someone who likely just sharpened their bone saw using a brick and then licked it clean. Because back in the 1500s, healthcare was less care and more good luck. It was a wild combination of superstition, old Greek theories, religious panic, trial and error, heavy on the error, and an alarming willingness to use anything that came out of the human body as medicine. Welcome to the system where the best case scenario was leeches and the worst case was, well, a hot poultice of human waste, but we'll get to that later. Hello travellers, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin with the Four Humours, which sounds like the name of a mediocre tavern band, but was actually the foundation of all Tudor medicine. This theory, inherited from ancient Greece and clung to like a mouldy life raft, stated that the body was made up of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your health depended on keeping these in perfect balance. Too much yellow bile, you're probably angry and feverish. Too much black bile, depressed. Too much blood, you're happy but don't get cocky because they'll likely bleed you anyway, just to be safe. Tudor doctors, if you could call them that, spent a lot of time analysing how wet or dry or hot your body was based on these humours. Got a cold? That's too much phlegm. Solution? Dry you out. Fever? Too hot. Let's cool you down by, say, applying a dead pigeon to your chest, or making you drink vinegar with powdered pearls. Logical? No. Traditional? Absolutely. And who were these so-called medical experts? Well, let's just say the hierarchy of healers was less hospital staff and more bizarre RPG class list. At the top, you had physicians, university-educated men who read Latin, quoted Aristotle, and rarely if ever touched a patient. Actual touching was for the dirty work folks. Then came the apothecaries, who mixed up medicines from herbs, minerals, and other stuff they found under the cupboard. Then, the surgeons, who were basically glorified butchers with knives. And finally the barbers, who doubled as tooth pullers, bloodletters, and occasionally amateur brain surgeons. Yes, you could go in for a trim and come out missing a molar and 300 milliliters of blood. One-stop shop. Now you'd think cleanliness might play a role in all of this. You'd be wrong. Bathing in Tudor England was considered suspicious. People believed that washing too often, especially with hot water, opened your pores and made you vulnerable to illness. Open pores? Disease can just walk right in. It's science. If you define science as stuff my Uncle Jeffrey swears is true because his neighbour once said it. So instead of washing, people just layered on perfume, rosewater, or, for the lower classes, simply ignored the concept entirely and hoped the smell would go away on its own. Hygiene standards were, to put it gently, non-existent. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows into the street. The phrase "Gardy Loo," a warning cry meaning watch out for airborne human waste, was a part of everyday vocabulary, and the streets of London, rivers of filth, often ankle-deep with mud, urine, and all the bodily fluids no one wanted to deal with. If you were lucky, you only got splashed by something you could identify. Let's talk tools. Medical instruments in the Tudor period looked like torture devices because, well, they basically were. Amputations were done without anesthesia, unless you count bite down on this, and try not to scream too loud. Cauterization was the go-to method for stopping bleeding, and trepanning, drilling a hole in your skull to let the demons out, was a real treatment option for migraines. Don't worry. The doctor probably washed his hands sometime last month. And speaking of hands, Tudor diagnosis involved a lot of bodily inspection, including tasting urine, smelling sweat, and analyzing the consistency of your snot. That's right. If you had a fever, someone might actually dip a pinky in your pee and go, "Ah yes." Hints of asparagus and impending death. Urinalysis charts existed, complete with color-coded illustrations that looked like a terrifying Pantone guide to disaster. But perhaps the most shocking thing about Tudor healthcare is how confident everyone was in it. These people really believed they were on the cutting edge, and in a way, they were, just not the right edge. Still, the dedication is admirable, even if the cures involved hot butter in the ears, burnt feathers under the nose, or for real, stuffing a live chicken's bottom against a plague boil to draw out the sickness. In conclusion, Tudor medicine was a wild ride through the valley of poor choices. It was part ancient philosophy, part medieval superstition, and part, let's just see what happens if we boil it. If you managed to survive it, congratulations, you were either very lucky, very rich, or just too stubborn to die. The good news? Your barber's also your doctor. The bad news? He's mostly trained in stabbing. If you're wondering how Tudor England ever arrived at the idea that human waste could be used as medicine, the answer is simple. Logic. The same kind of logic that says, I burned my hand on a stove, so I'll stick it in a fire to balance things out. Welcome to the murky mental gymnastics of Tudor medical theory, where the grosser it was, the more it must be helping. At the heart of this squishy reasoning was one word: balance. Tudor health was governed by a belief system so old it had metaphorical cobwebs on it. The theory of the four humours, handed down from Hippocrates and Galen. And according to this model, if your body was sick, it wasn't because of viruses, bacteria, or cholesterol. No, it was because your internal fluids were out of sync, like a badly tuned lute. So the solution was simple: restore balance by removing or adding substances to tip the scale in the right direction. Now, if you were feeling dry, you might be prescribed something moist. If you were too hot, the treatment might be something cold, or at least unpleasantly damp and suspiciously squishy. And if you were really unlucky, that meant applying bodily substances to counter your symptoms. You're pale and weak? Time for a dose of warm, dark, homemade sludge from someone stronger. You've got a raging fever? Let's cool it with a paste that smells like a latrine after a hot summer's day. It made sense to them. If disease is internal chaos, then perhaps external filth could somehow reorder it. This wasn't just balance, it was sympathetic magic, one of the most influential and totally bonkers concepts in early medicine. The idea was simple, like effects like, you've got yellow bile problems, treat it with something yellow, say mustard, urine, or some combination of the two. Got boils, maybe smear something equally nasty and pus-like on them to draw out the illness. It's the medieval version of fight fire with fire, only instead of fire, it's human waste. Tudor healers didn't stop at physical resemblance. They believed substances carried energy, qualities, even memory. So waste expelled during illness wasn't just refuse, it was a sample of the body's current state, a snapshot of your inner turmoil, which, in their minds, made it an incredibly useful tool. Why throw away such a handy diagnostic, an apparently therapeutic resource? And so, they created a kind of proto-recycling program, centuries before sustainability was cool. If the body expelled something, maybe it was meant to be repurposed. Boil it down, mash it up, and rub it right back in. In this way, human waste, feces, urine, sputum, became an organic pharmacy, albeit one that nobody wanted to browse after lunch. The body produced it, and so the body could absorb it again, just differently. Even more disturbing, context mattered. Waste wasn't seen as a one-size-fits-all cure. No, it had to be the right kind of waste. Healthy man feces might be prescribed to counteract melancholy, depression, because it came from someone who was clearly well-balanced. Think of it like Tudor probiotics. Except, instead of yogurt, it was literal poo. In some cases, the age, gender, and diet of the original donor were factored in. The more vigorous the source, the more potent the remedy. One physician even claimed the stool of a red-headed child was particularly effective for skin infections. Why? Absolutely no idea, but it probably sounded smart in Latin. And don't forget timing. Freshness was key. A nice, warm dollop of medicinal paste lost its strength as it cooled or aged. If that makes your stomach turn, congratulations. You are officially more modern than 16th century doctors. To be fair, this wasn't isolated to England. Across Europe, medical traditions had long incorporated the use of waste products, but the Tudors, being particularly fond of inherited wisdom and short on better options, really embraced it. There was a sort of poetic economy to it. The body, sickened by its own imbalances, could be healed by reintegrating what it had rejected, just through a different orifice. Let's also not ignore the unspoken truth. Tudor medicine was expensive, and a lot of people were poor. So the idea of using something readily available wasn't just logical, it was financially appealing. Why buy a foreign herb when your neighbor's toddler just had a healthy bowel movement? Free and organic, Of course, none of this actually worked, but when the alternative was praying and waiting to die, people were willing to try anything, including, apparently, playing catch and release with their insides. In modern times, we call this gross. In Tudor times, it was resourceful, because if your body's a temple, Tudor doctors were the kind of caretakers who swept everything into a pile and tried to fix the roof with mud. Or worse, one man's waste is another man's prescription, apparently. Tudor medicine didn't just theorize about using human waste. Oh no, it fully committed. There were actual recipes written in official medical manuals, enthusiastically copied down by apothecaries, healers, and maybe your friendly neighborhood dung enthusiast. These weren't vague old wives' tales. These were standard operating procedures. Want to stop a nosebleed? Apply a plug soaked in human urine. Got a rash? There's a cow dung solution for that. Are you about to vomit from hearing this? That's called the Tudor Cleanse trademark. Let's start with the poopiest of the poop-based potions, the cow dung poultice. This little masterpiece was used to treat everything from wounds to swellings to mysterious pains that probably just needed rest. The recipe was simple. Take some fresh cow dung. Yes, freshness mattered. No stale cow pies. Thank you. Mix it with butter or honey and apply directly to the skin. Apparently it drew out toxins. It also probably drew out friends and suitors. For chest colds and coughs, Tudor healers recommended something called a human dung plaster. No, that's not a euphemism. That's exactly what it sounds like. Instructions varied by region, but generally, you'd mix warm human feces, often from a child, because of course it had to be from a child, with some vinegar or lard, and smear it across the chest. The belief was that the heat and smell would stimulate the lungs. In reality, it likely just stimulated panic and existential dread. And don't think they limited themselves to just what came out of the back end. Earwax was used to treat cracked lips, and belly button lint was occasionally prescribed as part of folk remedies for nosebleeds and headaches. How did they harvest belly button lint before t-shirts existed? The historical record is blessedly vague. Then there's the legendary wound salve of the wise woman of Wandsworth, a handwritten cure-all passed around in Tudor England. This glorious recipe included sheep dung, snail slime, and human urine boiled together with sage and applied as a sort of goopy herbal wrap. It was supposed to promote healing, though it more likely promoted flies. But perhaps the most bizarre and prestigious waste-based cure wasn't waste at all. It was powdered mummy. That's right. Dead Egyptian nobles ground up into a fine powder and sold as medicine. Rich Tudors ate it, snorted it, smeared it on wounds, and even used it in love potions. Forget Pharaoh. You were about to become ferociously moisturized. And why was this acceptable? Because people believed that a body preserved for thousands of years had somehow absorbed ancient magic. In reality, most mummy powder sold in Europe was either graveyard dirt, random bones, or, yes, powdered human waste passed off as exotic medicine. This may explain why so many Tudor aristocrats walked around looking slightly nauseous. Need to treat pink eye? Easy. Use a solution of warm milk mixed with a pinch of dried dung, administered carefully to the affected eye. The prescription often included reciting a short prayer, because divine intervention was really your only hope after that. Let's not leave out the role of urine, a true medical superstar in the Tudor toolkit. Beyond being used for diagnostics and breakfast chats, probably, it was also employed for cleaning wounds, brushing teeth, and even as a skin brightener. Some beauty manuals recommended letting it sit in the sun until it ripened, then dabbing it on your face for that radiant, sun-kissed, fermented urine glow. If someone says you look refreshed, they might be lying. There was also the ever-popular sweat cure. The patient would be wrapped in hot blankets, and if they didn't sweat enough, the physician might apply a poultice of horse manure and vinegar to the soles of the feet. The logic? Induce sweating and purge the illness through your toes. The result? A deeply unpleasant foot sauna no spa on earth will ever replicate. Oh, and for treating internal bleeding, there was a drink known as black water. This delightful beverage included soot, stale ale, and, you guessed it, a trace amount of feces. Stir well, hold your nose, and prepare to definitely not get better. All of this raises an obvious question. Why? Why go to such lengths, or depths, of human waste? Because in Tudor minds, if it came from the body, maybe it could fix the body. The body, after all, was viewed as a self-contained system, like a garden compost bin. Take something out, put something back in, circle of life, but more squelchy. Of course, many of these remedies did nothing. Some even caused infections, made conditions worse, or simply humiliated the patient into silence. But when your other options included leeches, trepanning, or a prayer circle led by your neighbor with 3 teeth and a goat, even the most putrid plasters started to seem medicinal. So if you're ever feeling a little under the weather and find yourself reaching for modern medicine, just take a moment to appreciate that nowhere in the instructions does it say, apply thin layer of human waste, and whisper to it softly. Smells like healing, also smells like regret. If you think modern medicine sometimes smells fishy, wait until you hear about the golden days of Tudor healthcare. Literally, because in the 16th century, urine wasn't just waste, it was a multi-purpose miracle, a diagnostic tool, a cleaning agent, a beauty product, a wound disinfectant, a base for toothpaste, a gift that kept on leaking. In Tudor England, urine was the medical equivalent of duct tape. There was almost nothing it couldn't do, at least according to the brave, nose-blind souls of the time. To them, it was the purest distillation of your internal health. It came from your body. It was your body. So naturally, Tudor doctors leaned in. Noses first. Let's start with urinalysis, which was the cutting-edge diagnostic practice of the day. Physicians would examine the color, clarity, smell, and even taste of your pee to determine what was wrong with you. And yes, I said taste. Some doctors had a system so precise, they could tell you whether your liver was sad, your bile was boiling, or if your pancreas was having an existential crisis, all based on how zesty your urine was that morning. They used urine charts, beautifully illustrated guides filled with pots of pee shaded from pale lemon to dark amber to uh-oh, this one glows. Each hue corresponded to a diagnosis: too light, you're cold and damp; too dark, hot and angry; too bubbly, definitely cursed. And of course, if it had floaters, well, you might want to start writing your will. There were entire lectures devoted to pee observation. Apprentices were taught to sniff with purpose. Physicians would gather around jars of freshly passed fluid, nodding solemnly like wine connoisseurs at a tasting. Ah yes, a robust body, hints of kidney failure, and just a touch of asparagus. But the Tudors weren't content with just inspecting urine. They found ways to use it, lots of them. For instance, cleaning wounds. Urine, particularly if it was aged a bit, because nothing says sterile like left in a sunny window for 3 days, was thought to draw out infection and encourage healing. Soldiers were sometimes instructed to pee on their own wounds in battle. Field medics carried flasks of urine, like it was holy water. Honestly, if you saw someone coming at you with a full bladder, you weren't sure if they were about to heal you or start a duel. Then there was eye care. That's right. Got an eye infection? A little sty? You might be prescribed a gentle rinse of child's urine, because the younger the bladder, the purer the medicine. Fresh, warm, directly collected, apply twice daily, and try not to scream. And yes, toothpaste. You see, Tudor dental hygiene was enthusiastic, if not effective. Some people used soot, others used crushed bone, but for those in the know, urine was the secret to pearly whites, preferably Portuguese urine, which had a reputation for being extra potent. It was used to whiten teeth, remove stains, and somehow freshen breath. If your date had dazzling teeth, you might want to think twice before asking how they got them. Let's not forget skincare. Urine was used in face masks, anti-wrinkle creams, and spot treatments. It was believed to soften skin and give you that youthful glow, which was ironic, because smelling like a urinal didn't exactly scream flower of maidenhood. Some beauty guides recommended mixing it with rose water for that perfect balance of elegance and ammonia. And for earaches, the classic Tudor move was to warm a bit of urine and drop it directly into the ear canal. Preferably your own, though in a pinch, someone else's would do. This was believed to clear out infection and improve hearing. Whether it worked is unclear, but people likely pretended to feel better just to make it stop. Even laundry got the golden touch. Before soap became widespread, aged urine, called lard, was collected in barrels and used to wash clothes, bleach fabrics, and remove grease stains. Tanners used it to soften leather. Dyers used it to set colors. Public urinals weren't just plumbing, They were valuable collection points for the pea economy. Yes, there was an actual urine trade. And while we're here, let's address the fact that many apothecaries charged for high-quality urine. The health of the person it came from, their diet, age, temperament, affected the price. If you were rich, you might get the bottled stuff. If you were poor, well, you probably contributed. But for all its golden glory, Tudor urine medicine was rooted in desperation and observation. People noticed that urine stung wounds less than brackish water, that it broke down grease, that it had a sharp cleansing bite. From there, they just rolled with it, rolled it into your wounds, into your eyes, into your beauty routine, and occasionally into your mouth. Because nothing says doctor like sniffing someone else's pee. And Tudor tip, when life gives you lemons, make a urine chart. If you lived in Tudor England and heard the word plague, your first reaction was probably to scream, run, and start burying relatives in advance. But for those who stuck around, there was a pressing question: how do you not die in a world that smells like death? The Tudor answer: make it smell even worse. Welcome to the golden age of the miasma theory, the dominant medical idea that diseases like the plague were caused by bad air, or miasmas. These deadly vapors were believed to drift through the streets, especially at night or in warm weather, carrying all manner of invisible death particles. No one had heard of bacteria, but everyone was convinced that if something smelled bad, it must be deadly. The logical solution: overwhelm it with other bad smells. Bonus points if they were organic and freshly deposited. In short, to survive the plague, all you had to do was outstink the plague. This theory led to some of the most bizarre, nose-curdling medical practices in history. People hung dead animals in their homes to absorb the poisonous air. They carried pomanders, little balls of herbs, spices, and sometimes ambergris, which is literally whale vomit, and held them under their noses like portable hope grenades. But the truly hardcore, the die-hard believers, reached for something a little closer to home: human and animal waste. Yes, Tudor citizens genuinely believed that sniffing human waste could protect them from the plague. The logic, if you can call it that, went something like this: if the air is already foul, the bad smell might either block the plague vapors or, somehow, distract them. The scent of feces was considered grounding, earthy, and powerful enough to repel the dark magic of disease. This wasn't just folk superstition. Physicians wrote it down, endorsed it, and applied it with horrifying enthusiasm. One popular method involved taking cow dung, preferably stewed or still warm, because of course, and placing it in a cloth to sniff periodically throughout the day. This was sometimes carried in a pouch, or simply smeared inside masks or around doorways. If you were rich, you might upgrade to fermented human waste, left to sit in the sun to enhance its bouquet, aged to perfection. Like wine, but traumatic. And the logic didn't stop at carrying stink around. It extended to fumigation. People literally burned dung in their fireplaces to fill their homes with protective smoke. Imagine coming home, after a long day, only to be greeted by a cloud of hot, steamy excrement mist. The scent of safety. If safety smells like a stable floor, some even recommended burning shoe leather, soaked in urine, a sort of Tudor air freshener from the ninth circle of hell. Public health officials during plague outbreaks actually ordered dung to be spread in certain areas to purify the streets. The goal wasn't to clean. Oh no. The goal was to compete with the plague air. And if your neighborhood already smelled like a backed-up outhouse on a summer day, great. You were ahead of the curve. Of course, this led to some extremely awkward household decorations. Forget flowers in a vase. Some families literally displayed buckets of human waste in corners of the room, hoping the constant stench would act as a plague shield. And you thought potpourri was outdated. But perhaps the strangest version of this logic involved something called a plague posy. These were little bundles of herbs, and sometimes, let's say, aromatic extras. While most were just rosemary and lavender, others were mixed with droppings from animals, thought to enhance their protective power. Children were told to sniff them constantly. Nothing says comfort like sticking your nose into a turd-scented bouquet before bedtime. To be fair, this was all part of a desperate, sincere effort to survive. Tudor people knew the plague was deadly, but they didn't know how it spread, so if the world was killing you with invisible death fog, the only defense was smell-based warfare. It was a stink or be stunk world, and everybody, had their own strategy. Interestingly, some success stories emerged. People who surrounded themselves with filth and didn't catch the plague. Were they lucky, immune, or just so rank that even fleas gave up? Who knows? But these outliers only reinforced the idea that bad smells had protective power. In their minds, if the plague was a beast stalking the streets, then your own stench was the only thing scary enough to drive it off. Of course, none of this worked. The plague didn't care what you were sniffing. But without germ theory, this was cutting-edge science. And let's be honest, given the choice between rotting to death and rubbing cow waste under your nose, some people made their peace with the pasture. So next time you walk past a public toilet and recoil in horror, take a moment to appreciate that you don't live in a time when that smell would have been marketed as a plague repellent. Because in Tudor England, imagine choosing between the sweet smell of roses and a steaming pile of poo, and confidently picking Team Turd. The scent of safety was whatever made your eyes water. So you've followed your Tudor doctor's advice. You've smeared a lukewarm concoction of cow dung and vinegar on your chest, rinsed your eye with second-hand child pee, and let fermented manure smoulder in the fireplace while you sleep. The good news? You're being very proactive about your health. The bad news? You've probably just invented 5 new infections and a lawsuit that won't exist for another 400 years. Welcome to the aftermath of Tudor medicine, where the treatments often hurt more than the disease itself. In some cases, they were the disease. Let's be clear, applying waste to the body is not sterile. It was never sterile. Even back then, you didn't have to be a genius to realize that rubbing human waste on a wound wasn't exactly minty fresh. But in the absence of germ theory, sanitation, or literally any better idea, people doubled down. And oh, the side effects. Let's start with the obvious: infection. Open wounds treated with dung poultices were essentially being offered up as 5-star hotels for bacteria. Picture it: a fresh gash on the leg, lovingly coated with a smear of cow droppings and bandaged with a bit of wool that's been in a drawer since the Crusades. Within days, it's red, it's oozing, it smells like betrayal, and congratulations, you now have sepsis, or tetanus, or both. You've entered the world of gangrene, and all you have to look forward to is amputation by candlelight. Next up, respiratory trauma. Remember all those helpful instructions to burn dung indoors to cleanse the air? Turns out inhaling toxic smoke from manure doesn't actually protect your lungs. It just sets them on fire in slow motion. Symptoms included coughing, choking, chest pain, and a delightful wheezing sound that told everyone in the room you were deeply committed to the worst ideas of your time. In some cases, prolonged exposure caused permanent lung damage, not to mention emotional damage to everyone forced to share your home. Then there was dermatological horror. Many waste-based remedies involved warm poultices, usually described in manuals as comforting or soothing. But let's translate that into plain Tudor English: hot poo compress. And while some patients may have hoped for relief, what they often got was chemical burns, skin ulceration, and an experience so humiliating that it lived on as a family story for generations. Here's a fun phrase from a real 16th century remedy: apply until the skin darkens. Now that sounds poetic, until you realize they meant necrosis. Yes, some remedies actually killed the skin, and once that tissue died, it could turn gangrenous, and then you're right back to having a barber surgeon sawing off your limb with a rusty knife and an encouraging nod. We also can't forget psychological side effects. Being told to drink a health tonic made with stale urine or apply a poultice of human waste to your chest was in many cases the last straw in a very fragile relationship between the patient and reality. One day you're sneezing, the next you're lying on the floor, marinated in compost, while your physician hums and takes notes. The trauma, unrecorded. The dignity, gone. And socially, don't even try to explain to your neighbors that the smell wafting from your home is therapeutic. Tudor gossip networks were brutal. One whiff of suspicious smells from your direction, and you'd be known forever as Dung-Faced Deborah or Compost Colin. Forget your ailment. You were now the punchline of the village pub, your reputation slathered in the same substance as your ointments. There were also cases of misdiagnosis by urine. Doctors who relied solely on taste or color to analyze a person's health often made fatal errors. A pale sample might suggest melancholia, leading to treatments involving bloodletting and fecal plasters when the patient was just dehydrated. Yellow urine might trigger aggressive purging, Or, worse, treatments involving ingestion of bizarre concoctions, like boiled sheep's urine mixed with nutmeg. Delicious. One physician reportedly treated a patient's cough by stuffing his nostrils with rags soaked in pig urine and dung, claiming it would absorb the evil vapors. It did absorb something, mostly the man's ability to breathe. He survived the cough, possibly because he passed out and nobody dared try it again. Then, there's the long-term health impact. Tudor children, subjected to waste-based remedies from birth, often developed chronic skin conditions, weak immune systems, and a healthy fear of towels. The repeated exposure to filth didn't build resistance. It just ensured a lifetime of sniffles, sores, and trust issues. So what did all this get them? Well, if the cure didn't kill you, it just ruined your reputation. You might survive the illness, but the side effects left a mark, physically, emotionally, and often olfactorily. These treatments were less about healing, and more about how much indignity a human could withstand before begging to be left alone. Side effects may include screaming, crying, burning sensations, unexpected loss of friends, chronic mistrust in doctors, and rethinking your life choices every time someone opens a chamber pot. Still, it was all done with the best intentions, and frankly, the worst results. You might think that being a Tudor monarch meant access to the best doctors, the finest remedies, and absolutely zero poop-related skincare. But you'd be wrong, very wrong. Because if you think Tudor peasants were weird about medicine, the nobility took that weirdness, wrapped it in silk, sprinkled it with rose petals, and called it courtly elegance. Welcome to the royal flush, where even queens didn't escape the bizarre bodily fluid bonanza that was Tudor healthcare. Let's start at the top. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Gloriana, the living embodiment of regal power, was smearing urine on her face. Yes, the woman who ruled an empire, outwitted assassins, and gave some of history's most savage speeches, also willingly dabbed herself with something that had passed through someone else's kidneys, all in the name of beauty. See, Elizabeth had a bit of a skin problem, specifically smallpox scars, and like any public figure, she didn't want her image of eternal radiant majesty tainted by mortal imperfections. Enter Venetian ceruse, a fashionable white paste made of white lead and vinegar, which she used as a foundation. It gave her that ghostly glow seen in portraits. But ceruse was also toxic. Prolonged use caused skin deterioration, hair loss, and irony of ironies, even more blemishes. The cure was worse than the scars. To help with that damage, court beauty guides recommended dabbing the skin with urine to soften the complexion, preferably young male urine, aged slightly for added potency. Because what else pairs beautifully with lead poisoning? Urine facials, of course. So when you see a portrait of Elizabeth with that flawless alabaster skin, remember behind the scenes, her beauty routine had the ingredients of a medieval crime scene, and nobody dared say a word, probably because they didn't want their heads removed, or because they were also doing the same thing. And Elizabeth wasn't the only one engaging in royal self-sabotage in the name of medicine. Her father, King Henry VIII, was notorious not just for his 6 wives and violent mood swings, but also for his exploding leg wound. That's not poetic imagery. That's an actual, festering ulcer on his thigh that refused to heal, and occasionally burst open with a smell that cleared courtrooms. His physicians applied all the hottest Tudor remedies, including poultices of animal fat, herbs, and feces. Yes, they literally packed his royal thigh like a biological lasagna, and hoped for the best. And what did Henry do? Grin and bear it? Absolutely not. He roared at his physicians, threatened executions, and once tried to design a special chair to keep pressure off his royal buttocks while the wound was airing out. The smell became legendary. Some courtiers reportedly fainted from it. Others simply assumed it was a sign of God's divine wrath, or maybe just a poor choice of treatment. Meanwhile, noble women at court weren't much better off. They followed elaborate beauty rituals involving stale bread soaked in warm milk and urine to cleanse their faces. Hair rinses often featured fermented urine to add shine. Some even used pigeon droppings in their nightly skincare regimen. The Tudors clearly believed that the path to radiance was paved in filth. There were also royal tonics prescribed by elite physicians, which sometimes included mummy powder, ground bezoars, undigested hairballs from animals. And no surprise here, small quantities of feces from healthy children. believed to balance the humours. You haven't known privilege until your stool sample has been hand-selected for the crown. Let's not forget perfume, either. While royals wore fragrances far more luxurious than the common folk, they often masked the same underlying funk, since nobody was bathing regularly. Queen Elizabeth reportedly changed her clothes several times a day, but bathed once a month at most, and her doctors sometimes advised against washing entirely during illness, lest her pores open and invite disease. So the perfume, less Chanel No. 5. More Eau de Cowfield. Even royal childbirth wasn't safe from these medieval innovations. Midwives might bless the birthing chamber with burnt feces or dung incense, meant to drive away evil spirits and purify the air. Imagine going into labor and someone lights a human waste candle next to you. Nothing says serenity like the smell of barn fire and regret. And if you were too sick to walk, royal apothecaries would bring the treatments directly to your bedchamber, often including leech applications, urine compresses, and pills made from dried animal parts, all presented on silver platters, of course, because it's not gross if it's gilded. So yes, while peasants were down in the muck quite literally, nobles were right there with them. They just paid more for it. Their dung came from rarer animals. Their urine came in crystal bottles. But at the end of the day, whether you were a shepherd or a sovereign, you were still rubbing something awful on your skin and praying for divine mercy. Royal treatment? More like royal mistake. Long live the Queen, and may her face cream never be traced back to a chamber pot. When people think of Tudor England's economy, they might imagine wool, spices, or maybe shipbuilding, but hidden beneath all the silks, swords, and sovereigns was a booming, if deeply aromatic, industry, bodily fluids. Yes, in Tudor times, your pee and waste could pay. The economy had room for everyone, even your bowels. Welcome to the poop-based marketplace, where flushing money down the toilet wasn't just a metaphor, it was a business model. Let's start with solid assets. In the absence of modern fertilizers, Tudor farmers were obsessed with animal and human dung, which was practically the gold standard for enriching soil. Human waste from the cities, politely referred to as night soil, was collected, carted, and sold to farmers, often by the delightful profession known as nightmen. These men would prowl the streets after dark, emptying chamber pots and cesspits, sloshing human waste into barrels, and wheeling it off to the countryside by dawn. Think of them as early morning Uber drivers. But for human waste, it was back-breaking, nose-destroying work, but it paid, and it kept the city from turning into a literal swamp of feces, at least temporarily. Of course, not all waste was created equal. Cow dung was prized by apothecaries for its supposed healing properties, while goose droppings had niche appeal for poultices. But the real value came when your excrement got bought by the ounce and prescribed as medicine. Suddenly, that awkward bowel movement, cha-ching. While human waste had its place, urine was the real rock star of the waste-based economy. It wasn't just medicinal, it was functional. You could clean your clothes with it, set fabric dyes with it, bleach your linens, even help process leather by using it to soften hides. Tanners actually preferred older urine because nothing says top-grain leather like ammonia-soaked sheepskin. The sheer demand for urine led to one of the strangest economic arrangements in history, selling your pee. In towns and cities, it was common to find urine collection barrels outside dye houses or tanneries. Citizens, rich, poor, sober, or drunk, would relieve themselves into a communal pot and maybe earn a few pence in return. The more you drank, the more you earned. Suddenly, a night at the tavern became a business expense. This was so widespread that in some regions, governments placed taxes on collected urine. Yes, really, a urine tax. The authorities knew that if people were literally bottling bladder fluid for profit, they might as well get their cut. Imagine your tax form today, asking for annual urine output, next to your W-2, and if you think this sounds ridiculous, keep in mind that a Tudor who peed a lot could make more passive income than a street juggler. It was the original side hustle, a bodily subscription service before OnlyFans existed. Now, if you're going to turn waste into wealth, you need the right tools, and so the humble chamber pot became a household essential. This wasn't just a bucket, it was a statement. For the rich, chamber pots were made of fine porcelain, pewter, or even silver. For the rest of us, wood, clay, or tin would do the trick, as long as it held the goods. Manufacturers sprang up to serve the market. often personalizing pots with engraved insults, jokes, or even royal faces, because nothing says respect like relieving yourself on the likeness of your least favorite noble. One preserved Tudor pot even bears the inscription, "Have it ye, old knave." Chamber pots were cleaned by professionals or, more often, dumped out of windows by servants, leading to the well-known street cry, "Gardez-l'eau," from the French "Regardez-l'eau," or "Watch out for the water." Translation: incoming poop bomb. In wealthier homes, these pots were collected and emptied by domestic staff, sometimes multiple times per day. Meanwhile, in cities, entire networks of waste removal contractors developed, bidding on rights to clean cesspits. This wasn't a fringe business. It was a civic necessity, complete with licensing and turf wars. If your neighborhood waste guy didn't show up, you weren't just inconvenienced, you were under siege from your own plumbing. Believe it or not, the bodily waste trade actually influenced urban planning. Cities designed special waste collection routes. Tanneries and dye houses were built near waste-rich areas. Some landlords even charged extra for tenants with chamber pots, knowing they could get a cut of the sweet, sweet dung trade. And for enterprising apothecaries, bodily waste was just more stock. They purchased urine and feces from trusted donors, often keeping records of particularly effective specimens. Sort of like a Yelp for human waste. They might advertise mixtures like potion of Master Gregory's golden stream or ointment of Judith's blessed loaf. Naming your medicine after a stranger's bowel movement was peak Tudor branding. So yes, in Tudor England, your waste was worth something. It was recycled, repurposed, taxed, traded, and occasionally treasured. Whether you were peeing for pennies or shoveling muck for the crown, you were participating in the bodily fluid economy. It was gross, it was profitable, it was real. Imagine paying your rent based on how often you pee, or calling your chamber pot your business partner. In Tudor England, your bodily functions could turn a profit. Talk about passive income. When you think of Tudor medicine, your first thought might not be luxurious aroma. After all, these were the folks rubbing cow dung on wounds and brewing up health tonics that could double as biological warfare. But believe it or not, there was a sensational side to this messy history, one where perfume met human waste, and pseudoscience tried desperately to make your body odor smell like something you'd willingly bring home. You see, the Tudors didn't just bathe rarely, they actively feared bathing. They believed that washing with water could open the pores and let diseases sneak in. So naturally, instead of scrubbing themselves clean, they opted to layer stench with scent, a kind of olfactory arms race. And this logic extended beautifully and horribly into medicine. Let's start with the medical staple of the day, the human waste poultice, a classic Tudor remedy involving a foul paste of human or animal waste, smeared on wounds, infections, or just wherever you were feeling unlucky. But even in the 1500s, people had noses, and those noses were not thrilled. So physicians, desperate to preserve both humoral balance and social decency, began adding aromatic herbs, floral oils, and even spices to their sludge recipes. Imagine going to the apothecary and being handed something described as a lavender-scented dung balm with notes of thyme, mint, and disappointment. Lavender in particular was the go-to. It symbolized purity and calm, the complete opposite of, say, a steaming clump of cow feces. So it was sprinkled liberally over everything from wound pastes to bed linens. Chamomile and rosemary made frequent appearances too, not because they worked medicinally, but because if someone was going to rub droppings on their chest, they at least wanted to smell like a hedge, and thus was born the strange hybrid of scented treatments, where physicians and patients entered a delicate dance of denial. The logic was simple. If the bad smell of disease could be warded off by human waste, hello miasma theory, then the bad smell of the human waste needed a good smell to counterbalance that, which might double the healing, or confuse the disease, or just make the experience slightly less traumatizing. It was never entirely clear, but the result was cures that smelled like someone had dropped a rose garden into a stable floor. Some physicians even got fancy with it, whipping up recipes that included essential oils mixed directly into aged urine. You haven't lived until you've seen a historical recipe call for 6 drops of clove oil in a cup of warm man water. These concoctions were promoted as invigorating, restorative, and in one case, charming to the humours. That's Tudor. for we don't know what this does, but it smells okay. Then came the fumigation blends, the DIY aromatherapy of the Tudor world. These were bundles of herbs, spices, dried flowers, and sometimes, yes, dried animal droppings, set on fire to purify the home. The idea was that the good smells would overpower the bad airs, while the dung smoke added that extra punch of plague prevention. It's like incense. If incense made you gag and rethink your life, you'd find these stinkin' sweet combos in plague posies too. The famous flower bundles people carried to their noses to avoid the deathly air. But while some posies were purely floral, others included ingredients like dried cow pats, ground charcoal, or stale urine-soaked linen, gently masked with petals and cinnamon. That's right, cinnamon-scented pea cloths. Tudor medicine's answer to Febreze. Even some medicated perfumes were sold as treatments. One Elizabethan favourite, a perfumed salve containing rose oil, ground nutmeg, and powdered mouse droppings. Meant to be rubbed on sore muscles, it allegedly soothed aches while making you smell fit for supper. Depending on what supper smelled like back then, of course. Fashionable nobles even began commissioning their own personalised perfume poop potions, believing their unique blend of humours required equally unique treatments. Apothecaries would blend oils and waste by request. For the Earl, a mixture of rosemary, frankincense, and goose guano. Make it festive. These high-end treatments were stored in decorative jars, displayed like prized possessions, and applied with all the elegance of someone slowly poisoning themselves. Of course, not everyone bought into this fragrant fantasy. Some wrote disapprovingly of the confusing practices of mixing perfume with filth. One 16th century critic called it a courtly stink and accused nobles of bathing in roses while rotting from the inside out. But hey, if your options were death, untreated smallpox, or a rose-scented feces scrub, you might get used to the idea, or at least become very, very selective with your inhaling. So yes, while Tudor medicine was often gross, it was rarely unscented. There was always someone nearby with a pouch of sweet herbs or a drop of myrrh oil to make the horror a little more palatable. Not effective, mind you, just less likely to make your caretaker faint, because in the end, Tudor treatment was a 3-step process. Spray, pray, and smear away. Just don't ask what's in the bottle. And no, Eau de Poops was never a bestseller, but it did clear the room. So here we are, at the end of a long, stinky, brown-tinted journey through Tudor medicine. We've sniffed the past, gagged at the cures, and winced at the idea of perfume-drenched poo plasters. And yet, somehow, astonishingly, people survived. Not everyone, of course. Plenty didn't. Tudor England was a dangerous place, full of plague, war, religious turmoil. But the fact that anyone survived long enough to pass down their genes is nothing short of miraculous. They lived through poop-based treatments and still managed to invent the printing press, build the foundations of modern science, and compose some pretty great poetry, all while smelling vaguely like a burnt barn. So how exactly did we make it through? For starters, humanity is nothing if not relentlessly optimistic. Even when people didn't understand disease, bacteria, or the concept of sterile instruments, they still tried. Every absurd poultice, every eyeball rinse with warm urine, every dung smoke fumigation came from a place of wanting to help. There's something oddly beautiful about that. Horrifying but beautiful. Tudor physicians weren't evil. They weren't trolls trying to make people rub goat droppings on open wounds for fun. They genuinely believed they were doing their best. And in some twisted way, they were. They worked with what they had. Theories, traditions, trial, and a lot of very error-heavy error. They turned to the 4 humours, to astrology, to prayers, to potions made from mummified remains. Not because they were dumb, but because they were desperate. And desperation in the hands of a species as stubbornly inventive as ours leads to wild innovation. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it leads to pea toothpaste. And the patients, they were just as tough. These were people who got a splinter, feared it would turn into gangrene, and still went to work the next day, who endured childbirth without anesthetic, tooth extractions with pliers, and medical advice from someone who also cut hair and pulled teeth on weekends. Their stomachs were strong. Their wills were stronger. Honestly, they survived plague, famine, human waste medicine, and England's weather. What's your excuse for skipping leg day? There's something else this era teaches us. The sheer creativity of human problem-solving. even when it's completely unhinged. If you told a Tudor doctor, "I have a headache," they might respond, "Have you tried boiling a goat's eye with thyme and applying it to your feet? Was it nonsense?" Yes, but it was detailed nonsense, thought out, carefully prepared, served warm ideally. It also shows how medicine, like everything else, is a product of its time. What seems barbaric now was cutting edge then. One day, people might look back on our practices, like elective surgery, chemical peels, or drinking 12 different supplements a day, and say, what were they thinking? And to be fair, we're still trying to eat charcoal in our smoothies. So maybe we're not that far off. Another lesson? Resilience doesn't always look clean or noble. Sometimes it looks like trudging through life with untreated syphilis and a hope-soaked turd poultice strapped to your back, and still getting up the next day to farm, flirt, or write a sonnet. That's humanity, disgusting and determined in equal measure. Because no matter how wrong they were, no matter how repugnant the cures or how outrageous the theories, people kept going. They raised families, they built cities, they paved the way, and eventually, they learned. The bad ideas didn't last forever. Over time, knowledge replaced myth, science replaced superstition, and eventually someone figured out that maybe, just maybe, poop isn't medicine. But the instinct behind it, that will never go away. The instinct to heal, to help, to comfort. Even if it meant lighting dung fires and making perfume-enriched chamber pot salves in a twisted way, the Tudor world's worst ideas were born out of one of humanity's best traits. We can't help but try. And that, honestly, is why we're still here. So next time you grumble about going to the doctor, or feel embarrassed about asking for a second opinion, remember your ancestors paid taxes on pee, wore poop-based skincare, and rubbed mummy dust on their wounds. You've already come a long way just by not doing that. In conclusion, turns out humanity's strongest trait might not be courage, or intelligence, or compassion. It might just be our stomachs. Thomas Edison, a genius inventor, or light bulb hoarding supervillain. Before he became the Wizard of Menlo Park, Thomas Edison was just a half-deaf, hyper-curious kid in Ohio who got kicked out of school for asking too many questions, and possibly for setting off a few too many chemical reactions indoors. Born in 1847 in Milan, Ohio, a town now mostly known for being the birthplace of Edison, and not much else, little Thomas Alva Edison was the kind of child who didn't wait for bedtime to start experimenting. He had 7 siblings, but unlike most kids in big families, Edison didn't fight for attention. He just absorbed it through sheer force of invention. By the time he was in elementary school, teachers had already labeled him difficult. In Edison's case, that translated roughly to asks whys every 3 seconds, and once tried to dissect a frog in the cloakroom. Eventually, his teacher told his mother he was addled, which in 19th century speak meant your son's brain is like a shaken snow globe, but with more explosions. In a move that would turn out to be incredibly wise, his mother pulled him from school and said, "Fine, I'll do it myself." Thus began Edison's homeschooling career, led not by a strict curriculum, but by a mother who believed her son wasn't broken, just curious enough to accidentally invent indoor fireworks. And boy, was she right. Edison devoured every science book he could find. If there was a library nearby, he probably read half of it and tried to improve the other half. While other kids were learning their multiplication tables, Edison was learning how to build a homemade telegraph and occasionally melt things he wasn't supposed to. Now, let's talk about the ears. Edison began to lose his hearing at a young age, and it got progressively worse throughout his life. The cause is debated. Some say it was a bout of scarlet fever. Others blame a train conductor who boxed his ears after a lab accident. Either way, the result was the same. Edison couldn't hear well, which only seemed to sharpen his focus. Imagine trying to tune out the world by accident and inventing the perfect conditions for obsessive tinkering. It was like giving a golden retriever noise-cancelling headphones and a soldering iron. But the real game changer came when he got a job selling candy, newspapers, and magazines on a Grand Trunk railroad train. Sounds boring? Not to young Edison. He used the baggage car as his mobile laboratory. Yes, he literally had a rolling science lab on a moving train. Most kids would have gotten fired for spilling soda. Edison got fired for starting a fire. See, he was performing chemical experiments while the train was moving. and let's just say the reaction was more combustible than educational. He also managed to set up a printing press on that train, publishing his own newspaper, the Grand Trunk Herald, which makes him possibly the only teenager in history to simultaneously run a science lab and a media company before the age of 16. Mark Zuckerberg, eat your heart out. After being booted from the train gig, Edison bounced around doing telegraph work, which in the 1860s was like being in tech support and software development. But with Morse code and wires, this job took him across the Midwest, where he continued his after-hours experiments in boarding houses, telegraph offices, and anywhere that had enough electrical current, and didn't mind the occasional minor explosion. By the time Edison hit his early 20s, he wasn't just tinkering, he was inventing, and failing, a lot. But the thing about Edison was that failure didn't faze him. He treated it like a lab partner, one that spilled acid sometimes, but still got the job done. He once said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work," which is a very inspiring way to describe blowing up yet another battery prototype. And yet, for all his chaos and questionable safety procedures, Edison had the one trait that would define his entire life: unstoppable curiosity. It didn't matter if the idea was practical, profitable, or borderline insane. If it sparked his interest, he'd chase it down like it owed him money. So if you're imagining young Edison as a soft-spoken future genius sitting quietly in a corner with a notepad, stop it. Picture instead a half-deaf teenager with acid stains on his coat, ink on his fingers, and a light bulb going off above his head, only to be followed by a small fire and a shouted, "Watch, took my sulfuric acid." From homemade newspapers to chemical mishaps on moving trains, the early life of Thomas Edison was less quiet genius and more chaotic neutral with a lab bench. And yet, somehow, it worked. He didn't follow the system, he rewired it, literally, because when you're raised on curiosity, deaf to distractions, and homeschooled by your mother and your own explosions, the only direction left to go is forward, fast, loud, and preferably with smoke. Thomas Edison didn't really live life. He wrung it dry, wired it up, and made it file for a patent. To call his work ethic intense is like calling lava a bit warm. This was a man who treated sleep like an annoying ad you couldn't skip. While most people dip into REM sleep to recharge, Edison dipped into brief naps between marathon invention sessions, emerging groggy and covered in graphite dust, ready to reinvent another household appliance, and possibly the very concept of leisure. The mythos of Edison's productivity is legendary, but what's worse is that it's mostly true. He regularly worked 18 to 20 hours a day. His idea of a break was switching from working on the phonograph to tinkering with electrical systems. While most of us hear burnout and think of long work weeks, Edison would have probably tried to patent burnout if he could find a way to monetize it. He once famously said, "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration," and judging by how rarely he bathed during work sprints, he meant that quite literally. This was a man who sweated his way through dozens of projects simultaneously, each one only half finished and half on fire, all while furiously scribbling notes like a caffeine-fueled crypt keeper. Edison was, without exaggeration, a productivity addict. He hated wasting time. He considered sleep a kind of moral failure, a betrayal of potential invention hours. While his peers were lying in bed counting sheep, Edison was probably counting voltage, calculating circuits, and considering whether the sheep could be wired into an early electric motor. His sleep strategy was the polyphasic nap, long before that became a trendy tech bro experiment. Instead of sleeping through the night like a normal person, he took 20-minute power naps throughout the day, often curled up in the corner of his lab, like a cat that had just invented static electricity. His favorite place to sleep? A cluttered workbench. The man practically spooned voltmeters. And it wasn't just Edison keeping vampire hours. His assistants were along for the ride, whether they liked it or not. Working for Edison was equal parts scientific breakthrough and unpaid overtime. He expected his team to mirror his pace: long hours, short breaks, and a high tolerance for live wires, exploding prototypes, and the constant sound of furious sketching. One assistant later said, "You didn't work for Edison, you just survived him." But Edison didn't see it as punishment. He saw it as passion. He believed in the grind like it was a sacred ritual. In fact, when reporters would ask about his long hours, He'd usually grin and offer a variation of, "I never did a day's work in my life." It was all fun, and fun for him apparently meant filing 1,093 patents, experimenting with concrete furniture, and possibly inventing the concept of burnout before it had a name. His laboratory wasn't just a workspace, it was a sleep-optional zone of chaos and productivity. He'd set up cots in the corners of the lab, not for comfort, but for strategic collapse. Assistants often fell asleep, still holding tools, waking up only when Edison slapped another half-finished diagram in front of them. He didn't need inspiration from muses, he needed more wire. Even meals were treated like inconvenient interruptions. Edison was known to forget to eat for hours, sometimes days, and would only pause when reminded by someone else, usually after he'd tried to use coffee grounds in a battery. He preferred simple, fast meals, eggs, bread, and his personal favorite, milk straight from the bottle, often while pacing and muttering about chemical reactions. A balanced diet? Only if balanced means can be consumed with one hand while soldering something with the other. But there was one true love that powered Edison, more than food, more than family, and certainly more than rest. Patents. Patents were Edison's personal drug of choice. They were the scoreboard in his never-ending game against time. Every successful filing was another trophy, another way to prove that yes, sleep is for cowards, and time is just another fuse to burn through. He hoarded patents like a dragon hoards gold, except instead of breathing fire, he probably just exhaled steam from a poorly insulated heating coil he designed himself. Edison's record, over 1,000 patents in his lifetime, wasn't just impressive, it was borderline pathological. He applied for patents the way most people check their emails constantly, and with a vague sense of panic. There was never just one project. There were always 10, always something else to tweak, file, launch, or electrocute into working condition. And through all of this, the man barely blinked. So the next time you hear about the grind-set lifestyle, the 5 a.m. club, or tech moguls who survive on kale and cold showers, just remember, Edison was doing that before it was cool, before it was smart, and arguably before it was medically advisable. The man didn't just skip sleep, he outran it, taunted it, and left it gasping in the corner of a smoke-filled lab. Because for Edison, rest wasn't just overrated, it was competition. Let's get one thing straight right out of the socket. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb. I know, that's like saying Shakespeare didn't invent love, or that Einstein didn't invent crazy hair. But the myth that Edison single-handedly pulled light from the darkness like some electric Prometheus is, at best, a very generous rewrite of history. What Edison did do was much more annoying, and frankly, much more Edison. He took an idea already floating around, worked on it obsessively, figured out how to make it profitable, and slapped a patent on it so fast you could hear the paperwork screech. To understand why this myth persists, you have to go back to a time when light meant fire hazard. The 1800s were not exactly well lit. Homes were illuminated by candles, whale oil lamps, and anything else that burned with some level of menace. There were already efforts to create electric light, but the problem was making it last. Early electric bulbs had a lifespan only slightly longer than a sneeze. Most glowed beautifully for all of 5 minutes before fizzling out or melting like a wax sculpture on a radiator. In fact, well before Edison, people like Humphrey Davy and Warren de la Rue had already experimented with incandescent light. Davy made an electric arc lamp back in 1802, which, to be fair, looked more like something you'd use to summon Frankenstein than read a book. Others used platinum filaments or carbon rods, but the materials were too expensive, the bulbs too fragile, or the results too inconsistent to go mainstream. Enter Edison, not the inventor of light itself, but the man who saw the mess, sniffed out a business opportunity, and said, "What if I just did this better, and made sure no one else could do it legally?" Edison's real genius wasn't inventing from scratch. It was improving, simplifying, and most importantly, owning. He took existing ideas, locked himself in a lab with his army of assistants, and tried thousands of filament materials, from cotton thread to cardboard to, you guessed it, bamboo. Yes, bamboo. He basically turned light bulb development into an episode of Mythbusters, only with more legal threats and fewer safety goggles. After what he claimed was more than 6,000 failed attempts, which may be exaggerated, but sounds great in interviews, He finally found a filament that worked. His bamboo-based bulb could glow for up to 1,200 hours. That's nearly 50 days of light from something that used to burn out in seconds. That was the breakthrough. Not just light, but durable, affordable, mass-producible light. And so, in 1880, he filed US patent number 223,898. A move that would change how the world functioned after sunset and how inventors functioned in courtrooms. He didn't just invent a bulb, he invented the right bulb, the one that wouldn't bankrupt the buyer or set their wallpaper on fire. Now, here's where it gets spicy. Edison didn't like competition, and by didn't like, I mean pursued with the intensity of a jealous raccoon guarding a trash can. When other inventors tried to improve their own versions of electric lights, Edison was quick to sue. He formed the Edison Electric Light Company, a name that practically screamed, "Back off. This filament is mine." His lawyers were nearly as busy as his engineers. So did Edison invent the light bulb? No, but he did invent the conditions under which it became practical, popular, and most importantly, protected under US patent law. That's why his name is in the textbooks. While people like Joseph Swan, a British inventor who also developed a working bulb around the same time, are lucky if they get a side note and a polite shrug. In fact, Swan and Edison's legal tangle over who got there first led to a delightful compromise, the Edison and Swan United Electric Light Company, a catchy name that sounds like a law firm, a steampunk band, or possibly both. In truth, it was just a way for Edison to absorb the competition, without admitting that someone else also had a pretty good light bulb idea, just on the wrong side of the Atlantic. What made Edison's bulb a global phenomenon wasn't just the glass and filament, it was the system he built around it. He didn't stop at the bulb. He developed the sockets, the switches, the power generation, and even the infrastructure to wire neighborhoods. It was like inventing the smartphone and the app store and the charging cable. That's where Edison truly earned his fame. Not for being the first spark, but for designing the entire electric ecosystem. And yet, the myth persists. Ask any third grader who invented the light bulb, and odds are they'll say, Thomas Edison while chewing on a crayon. Because in the end, the story stuck. Not because it was accurate, but because it was marketable. Edison didn't just light up homes, he lit up headlines. So the next time someone tells you Edison invented the light bulb, feel free to nod politely and say, "Sure, and Columbus discovered America while you're at it." The truth is messier, but in Edison's case, it's also a lot more interesting. After all, if you invented it in your garage, Edison probably already patented it in his, with bamboo, a team of lab assistants, and a slightly smug grin. When most people hear Menlo Park, they imagine some serene scientific sanctuary, a sort of peaceful garden where brilliant minds stroll around in lab coats, sipping tea and jotting equations in leather-bound notebooks. Wrong. Menlo Park under Thomas Edison was about as serene as a caffeine-addicted raccoon with a soldering gun. It wasn't a lab, it was a full-throttle, wire-strewn, sweat-dripping invention machine. Think less academic think tank and more unpaid internship during a lightning storm. In 1876, Edison founded his now famous research facility in Menlo Park, New Jersey. It was the world's first true industrial research laboratory, a place where ideas didn't just come to life, they were forced into existence under immense pressure, sleep deprivation, and the constant threat of being upstaged by the guy at the next workbench. This wasn't some solo genius in a garret routine. Edison's innovation style was industrialized chaos. He hired dozens of bright young men, often fresh out of school, brimming with hope, ambition, and absolutely no idea what they'd just signed up for. These assistants were the unsung heroes of his operation. They were expected to work day and night, bounce from project to project like caffeinated electrons, and somehow not die in a room filled with unstable chemicals, buzzing wires, and experimental batteries that occasionally caught fire. Menlo Park quickly earned its reputation as the invention factory, and like any factory, it was focused on production. Ideas weren't art, they were output. The goal was simple: make something new, then make it better, then patent it so no one else could, then move on to the next thing before the ink on the patent dried. Edison himself once boasted that he wanted to produce a minor invention every 10 days and a big thing every 6 months. That's not a research timeline, that's a threat. And the pace was brutal. Workdays stretched well into the night, or more accurately, never ended. Edison demanded long hours from everyone, And if you didn't collapse at your desk or accidentally electrocute your boots, it meant you still had energy to keep going. Assistants were often seen napping in corners, curled up under drafting tables, or half-conscious with their faces smushed against blueprints. At Menlo Park, if you weren't inventing, you were unconscious. And sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. But here's the kicker. It worked. From this madhouse emerged some of the most important inventions of the late 19th century. The phonograph, one of Edison's personal favorites, was born here, along with improved telephone transmitters, carbon microphones, and a parade of strange prototypes that never saw the light of day, but still ended up in a patent office somewhere. Edison kept things moving with the intensity of a battlefield commander. He would bounce from table to table, tweaking designs, barking instructions, occasionally changing the entire direction of a project, midstream just because he had a better idea, which usually meant more hours, more tests, and more wires mysteriously catching on fire. Despite the chaos, the Menlo Park system had structure. Projects were documented meticulously. Every experiment, success or failure, was logged, not out of scientific nobility, but because Edison knew that every scrap of progress could be monetized. If you found a better way to insulate a wire, congratulations. That's patent number 427. File it, protect it, cache it. The assistants were technically co-inventors, but Edison had a very specific filing system. Their names went in the notebook, his name went on the patent. If the invention made money, they might get a bonus or a thank you. More likely, they got a burned eyebrow and a strong recommendation letter, if they survived long enough to ask for one. You could argue that Edison invented the tech startup grind before Silicon Valley was even a twinkle in the world's over-caffeinated eye. Replace oil lamps with LEDs, chalkboards with whiteboards, and the smell of sulfur with the scent of toasted granola bars, and Menlo Park was basically the first tech incubator. Only this one also contained large amounts of unstable chemicals and zero human resources department. It wasn't all grueling though. The place had a sense of manic camaraderie. Inside the lab, assistants debated materials, argued about thermodynamics, and occasionally got into shouting matches about which type of filament exploded less often. There were jokes, pranks, and the occasional game of, "Don't touch that, it's live." A typical bonding exercise involved testing batteries by accidentally shocking yourself, and then pretending you meant to do it. And Edison was always there. He didn't just command from a distance. He was often shoulder-deep in projects, scribbling furiously, muttering to himself, and occasionally wandering into the wrong lab room and inventing something completely different by accident. Menlo Park didn't look like the future. It looked like a garage exploded. But out of that scorched, frantic mess came inventions that shaped the next century. So yes, Edison didn't work alone. He had a small army of underpaid nerds building the future, one sleepless night and one live wire at a time. Menlo Park wasn't a lab. It was a lightning storm that never stopped. And somehow they all learned to dance in it. If Thomas Edison had a nemesis, it wasn't sleep, boredom, or even legal boundaries. It was alternating current AC. And the moment it showed up wearing a lab coat with Nikola Tesla's name stitched on the pocket, Edison saw red, sparks, and probably a lawsuit waiting to happen. The late 1880s brought with them a massive question for the modern world. How do we electrify everything without burning the house down? Edison had already invested years and many overheated mustaches into a direct current DC system. It was safe, reliable, and utterly impractical for long-distance transmission. In Edison's setup, you basically needed a power plant every few blocks. Great. If you're building an empire of glowing street lamps, not so great. If you live more than 6 minutes from a dynamo, enter Nikola Tesla, the lanky, soft-spoken Serbian genius who dreamed in blueprints and may or may not have communicated directly with pigeons. Tesla championed alternating current AC, a system that could travel long distances with much higher efficiency. To the average citizen, the AC/DC debate sounded like a confusing band name, but to Edison, it was nothing less than a threat to everything he'd built, especially the part that printed money. Tesla joined forces with George Westinghouse, an industrialist with deep pockets and a suspicious amount of optimism. Together, they began installing AC systems in major cities, drawing attention, contracts, and Edison's absolute fury. And so began the Battle of the Currents, a scientific debate that quickly devolved into a very public, very dramatic, and occasionally horrifying propaganda war. This wasn't just about volts. This was about ego, empire, and electrical humiliation. Edison, never one to back down from a fight, especially one involving both wires and reputations, launched a smear campaign that made modern-day attack ads look like polite disagreements at a tea party. He argued that AC power was dangerous, unstable, and capable of killing people instantly, which, to be fair, was technically true, but also extremely out of context. Like saying cars are unsafe because you can drive them off cliffs. But Edison didn't stop at warning labels or safety seminars. No, he decided to demonstrate, and what followed was a series of public educational events that blurred the line between electrical engineering and horror theater. In one infamous display, Edison's team electrocuted stray dogs using AC current to show just how deadly it could be. These were billed as safety demonstrations, but to modern eyes, they look a lot like unethical science mixed with aggressive marketing. It was as if someone launched a public service campaign by building a haunted house filled with exploding kitchen appliances, and then came the elephant. Her name was Topsy, a circus elephant who had, tragically, developed a reputation for aggression after being mistreated by her handlers. In 1903, she was sentenced to be put down, and Edison's team saw a dark opportunity in an event filmed for posterity, because why not add cinematography to this moral collapse? Topsy was electrocuted in front of a crowd using AC current. The message was simple: AC will kill even the biggest beast alive. Now imagine what it'll do to your kid. Yes, Edison's idea of winning an argument wasn't just proving someone wrong. It was making a giant pachyderm-sized statement with a side of shock and awe. It was grotesque. It was effective. It was Edison. Meanwhile, Tesla took a radically different approach. He staged his own demonstrations too, but instead of frying elephants, he stood on stage and electrified himself with AC current to show how safe it could be when properly handled. He lit lamps with his fingertips, passed current through his body, and generally turned science into sorcery. If Edison was doom and gloom, Tesla was fireworks and finesse. He didn't fear electricity. He danced with it. Despite Edison's relentless attacks, AC eventually won. It powered the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, lit up entire cities, and became the backbone of the American electrical grid. It was cheaper, more efficient, and vastly better for long-distance transmission. Edison's DC was safe, but Tesla's AC was unstoppable. Still, Edison never really admitted defeat. He simply shifted gears, focusing on other inventions and quietly pretending the whole electrocuting animals in public phase had never happened. History remembers him for the light bulb, the phonograph, and other iconic breakthroughs, but in the shadow of those glories lies this bizarre chapter of PR warfare powered by electricity and ego. The Battle of the Currents was more than a scientific rivalry. It was a window into Edison's competitive soul, the part of him that didn't just want to innovate, but to dominate. It showed what happened when progress met pride, and nobody had yet invented public relations consultants. By 1903, Thomas Edison had already tangled with alternating current, lost the public debate to Tesla and Westinghouse, and spent years trying to convince the world that AC power was basically electricity with a criminal record. But if you thought that meant Edison would admit defeat with grace and quietly go invent another phonograph, you don't know Edison. No. When Edison lost the moral high ground, he dug a tunnel and installed a trapdoor, and at the bottom of that trapdoor, an elephant named Topsy. Now to be clear, Topsy wasn't Edison's pet, mascot, or even lab experiment. She was a former circus elephant, around 28 years old, who had lived a hard life full of mistreatment by humans. Originally brought to the US as part of the Four-Paw Circus, she was billed as a bad elephant after allegedly killing multiple handlers, though most reports suggest she was provoked. In one incident, her trainer tried to feed her a lit cigarette. She responded the way any self-respecting elephant would, by flinging him into the afterlife. Eventually, Topsy was sent to Luna Park, an amusement park on Coney Island, where her reputation preceded her. The park managers decided they needed to put her down, publicly. And as the saying goes, when you need a public execution with some electrical flair, you call Thomas Edison. To be fair and historically accurate, Edison himself wasn't directly involved. By 1903, he had already stepped away from the current wars, but his company, Edison Electric, was still keen on reminding the public that AC power was the devil's voltage. And so, when Luna Park reached out asking for a dramatic and preferably fatal demonstration of AC's lethality, someone at Edison Electric said, "Sure, we've got wires and no conscience, let's make it happen." And thus was born one of the most bizarre and disturbing public relations stunts in history. The plan: Topsy would be electrocuted with 6,600 volts of alternating current, and the entire thing would be filmed. Yes, filmed. Because nothing says cutting-edge science like turning a zoo into a crime scene and selling tickets to the front row. They even added a little extra for good measure. Before the electrocution, Topsy was fed carrots laced with cyanide and had copper sandals strapped to her feet, attached to the live wires, just in case anyone thought this was going to be a peaceful process. Spoiler, it wasn't. On January 4th, 1903, a crowd gathered at Luna Park. About 1,500 spectators stood in silence as Topsy, unaware of what was coming, was led into place. The switch was flipped, a spark, a jolt. A few seconds later, Topsy collapsed. The deed was done, and the cameras rolled the whole time. The resulting film, chillingly titled "Electrocuting an Elephant," was distributed by Edison Studios. Yes, that Edison Studios. It's widely considered one of the first filmed deaths in cinematic history. Forget award-winning documentaries or slow-motion nature films. Edison's team had effectively invented the snuff film of the electrical age, and all of this just to make alternating current look bad. Now, was AC power truly to blame here? Of course not. Any current handled with enough malice and voltage can be fatal. The science was real. The ethics, deep-fried. Topsy's death was less a cautionary tale about electricity and more a cautionary tale about what happens when science gets hijacked by ego and public spectacle. Topsy wasn't a villain. She wasn't a monster. She was a wild animal trapped in a human world that treated her like a toy, then a threat, and finally, a headline. Her death was wrapped in wires, coated in PR spin, and zapped into infamy. And the kicker, it didn't even work. AC power had already won. Tesla's system was lighting up the world, while Edison's smear campaign was still throwing sparks and animal corpses into the spotlight. By the time Topsy was electrocuted, it wasn't a scientific demonstration. It was a desperate, grotesque finale to a lost war. In the years since, Edison's legacy has gotten a bit of a polish, mostly highlighting his inventions, patents, and business empire. But buried under that glowing reputation is the charred memory of Topsy, a reminder that not all progress is noble, and not every experiment belongs in front of a cheering crowd, because in the end, nothing says trust my science like turning a zoo into a crime scene. Topsy's name lives on, not as a footnote to Edison's triumphs, but as a symbol of everything that went wrong when invention met exploitation. She was the elephant in the room then, and remains one now, a quiet, thunderous question about how far someone will go to prove a point. And if Edison had a chance to do it again, he probably would have patented it. Thomas Edison may not have invented the light bulb from scratch, or defeated Tesla in the electric showdown, or let's face it, walked away from animal electrocution with his dignity intact. But when it came to recording sound and motion, that's where the Wizard of Menlo Park struck cultural gold. In 1877, Edison unveiled something so revolutionary. People thought he had summoned it from another dimension, the phonograph. This was long before Spotify, vinyl, or even radio. Before Edison, if you wanted to hear a song again, you had to rely on memory or convince your uncle to sing off-key with a banjo for the 5th time. Edison's invention changed all that. Using a vibrating needle, a tinfoil-covered cylinder, and a healthy disregard for sleep, Edison created a device that could record and replay sound. His first recorded words, not a profound statement, not a poem, not even E equals mess. It was Mary had a little lamb. Because if you're going to kickstart the audio revolution, it might as well involve barnyard animals and nursery rhymes. The phonograph was groundbreaking. Finally, people could preserve speeches, music, even personal messages. You could listen to your great-grandfather talk about the weather in 1878 forever. And yes, future generations could now experience the haunting joy of hearing their ancestors sing slightly off-key renditions of Yankee Doodle. But like many Edison inventions, the phonograph was more than a gadget. It was a business empire waiting to happen. He immediately began pitching its uses: audiobooks, personal letters, dictation machines for businesses, and of course, music. Some ideas didn't quite take off, like the talking clock that recited the time in a gravelly voice that sounded more like a sleep-deprived butler, but others stuck, big time. The phonograph was the first time the human voice could be stored and replayed, which is adorable until you remember that means Edison also invented the voicemail, which we've all been trying to avoid ever since. But Edison wasn't done capturing reality. If you could trap sound in a metal cylinder, why not trap motion in a strip of film? So he got to work. In the late 1880s, Edison and his assistant William Kennedy Laurie Dixon developed the kinetoscope, one of the earliest motion picture viewing devices. The kinetoscope looked like a wooden cabinet you peered into. Like a Victorian iPhone, you could only use one eyeball at a time. Inside, a strip of film whirred through a series of gears and lights, giving the illusion of movement. It was mesmerizing. It was revolutionary. It was grainy footage of a man sneezing. Seriously, one of the first motion pictures ever made was titled Fred Ott's Sneeze, 1894. It's a black and white, 6-second film of Edison employee Fred Ott sneezing dramatically after sniffing some snuff. And just like that, cinema was born with nasal congestion. Soon, Edison opened the Black Maria Studio in New Jersey, named after the slang for police wagons because the building looked like one. It was the world's first film production studio, built on a rotating base so it could follow the sun for lighting. It looked less like Hollywood and more like a barn with stage lights. But inside it, Edison's team churned out dozens of short films. Dancers, boxers, vaudeville acts, and the occasional comedic brawl were all recorded on flickering reels. Edison didn't just film reality, he filmed performance, which meant, indirectly, he helped invent the very idea of celebrity, entertainment media, and eventually, Michael Bay sequels. Yes, it's a straight line from Fred Ott's Sneeze to Transformers 5, which means we can partially blame Edison for that too. Of course, this wouldn't be an Edison chapter without a little controversy. He spent a good chunk of his time suing other inventors over who really owned the rights to motion picture technology. While Edison made big strides, it was actually a whole cluster of inventors, including Etienne Jules Merry and the Lumiere brothers, who were simultaneously building the moving picture dream in Europe. But Edison had something even more powerful than invention: a ruthless legal team. If you had a camera that even looked like his kinetoscope, there was a decent chance someone in a bowler hat would show up at your office with a cease and desist, and possibly a fistful of patents. By 1908, Edison formed the Motion Picture Patents Company, basically a Hollywood mafia designed to control who got to make movies and who didn't. Want to film a western? Pay up. Want to make an experimental short about a man sneezing? Too late, he already did it, and he owns the nose rights. Ironically, his attempt to control film led many independent filmmakers to flee to California, where they set up shop far from Edison's litigious reach. That place, Hollywood. So yes, Edison helped start the movie industry, and also helped push it to the West Coast by being so lawsuit happy, directors literally skipped town. In the end, Edison didn't just capture sound and motion, he helped bottle culture itself. His inventions laid the groundwork for music labels, film studios, and an entire century of people complaining that movies aren't what they used to be. But hey, at least thanks to Edison, we still have audio proof of that terrible barbershop quartet your great-grandfather formed in 1895. Thomas Edison wasn't just a man of invention. He was also, let's say, challenging to collaborate with. Working with Edison was a bit like hugging a buzzsaw, technically possible, but you wouldn't come out unscathed. While he brought the world phonographs, power grids, and silent movies, he also left a trail of burned bridges, disillusioned assistants, and one very betrayed Serbian genius. Let's start with Nikola Tesla, the crown jewel of Edison's complicated relationships. When Tesla arrived in the US in 1884, he was young, brilliant, and brimming with ideas. He also had a letter of introduction from one of Edison's European associates that allegedly said, "I know two great men, and you are one of them. The other is this young man." That should have been a glowing welcome. Instead, Tesla ended up doing grunt work at Edison Machine Works, fixing electrical systems and redesigning inefficient motors. Edison was impressed with Tesla's ability to understand complicated systems, and more impressed by the fact that Tesla worked nearly as much as he did. At one point, Edison supposedly offered Tesla $50,000 if he could improve his DC generators. Tesla, being Tesla, did it. But when he asked for the reward, Edison laughed and allegedly said, "You don't understand our American humor," which is a fun way of saying, "That was never real, and I'm keeping the money." Tesla, shocked, quit almost immediately and began plotting revenge in the form of revolutionary science. If Edison were in a group project, he'd fire everyone else, finish it, and then put only his name on the PowerPoint slides. It was a pattern repeated over and over. He surrounded himself with talented assistants and engineers, brilliant minds who worked insane hours under brutal conditions. And when the breakthroughs came, Edison usually made sure the credit stopped with him, or more accurately, started with him and ended with his name being engraved on the patent. Take William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, the guy who helped pioneer Edison's early motion picture technology. Dixon did a huge chunk of the work developing the kinetograph and kinetoscope, the backbone of Edison's film efforts. But when the patents were filed, just Edison. Dixon eventually left and later helped form a rival motion picture company. And honestly, can you blame him? If you build the future and get labeled Assistant #3, you start thinking about revenge too. Then there was Francis Upton, a brilliant mathematician and physicist, who helped Edison develop the electric lamp and the electric power system to go with it. Upton did complex calculations that Edison couldn't, and was instrumental in turning the light bulb from neat prototype to national phenomenon. But in the press, it was always Edison who stood in the spotlight. Sometimes literally, under a bulb Upton had helped power. Edison's attitude toward collaborators was that they were tools, not partners. The lab was his stage. Everyone else was background actors, unless they sued him, in which case they briefly got a headline before being buried in legal fees. Now, you might be wondering, how did Edison keep getting away with it? Simple, he owned the narrative. He cultivated the image of the lone genius in the lab, lit by the glow of invention and driven by pure ambition. Journalists loved him. Investors trusted him. The public admired him. He didn't just build machines, he built a brand. Meanwhile, Tesla, who actually was a lone genius, spent his later years feeding pigeons and writing letters to imaginary people. He died broke and relatively obscure, while Edison's name was being chiseled into schools, buildings, and awards. Tesla got pigeons. Edison got credit. History is weird like that, but time, as it turns out, has a long memory. In recent years, the public perception has shifted. People began digging into the historical records, and the myth of Edison, the self-made wizard, started to crack. Books, documentaries, and even internet memes have helped highlight the contributions of the people Edison stepped on to climb higher. Tesla, once forgotten, is now a pop culture icon, complete with a car brand, video game cameos, and Reddit threads filled with fanboys declaring him the original tech god. His image is that of the misunderstood genius, ethereal, eccentric, electromagnetic. Meanwhile, Edison, still respected, still recognized, but now often with a footnote, also kind of a jerk. This isn't to say Edison didn't earn his legacy. He really was brilliant. He really did push technology forward, but he also pushed people aside to do it. He wasn't just an inventor, he was an operator, a strategist, a self-promoter who knew that history remembers names, not teams, and for a long time, that strategy worked, until one day, a new current started flowing. Revenge by reputation. The assistants got their due. Tesla rose from obscurity like a resurrected electric phoenix, and Edison, well, let's just say people now look at his accomplishments with a raised eyebrow and a slight side-eye. Thomas Edison died on October 18th, 1931, at the age of 84. The world lost one of its most prolific inventors, and also one of its most strategically competitive, occasionally shady, and gloriously sleep-deprived human beings. Newspapers across the globe mourned the loss of the Wizard of Menlo Park, while people everywhere dimmed their lights in tribute, which is kind of ironic, considering Edison would probably have charged them a small memorial fee per bulb. But his death wasn't just the end of a person, it was the closing act of an era, the age of mechanical marvels, wired empires and patents. So numerous you could wallpaper a mansion with them. Edison had filed over 1,000 patents in his lifetime. That's right. More inventions than most of us have emails in our inboxes. And not just trinkets either. We're talking power generation, recorded sound, motion pictures, batteries, electric pens, voting machines, and somewhere in there, a doll that talked, and also somehow terrified every child it ever met. He helped give the world light, and then spent a solid 2 decades making sure he got paid every time anyone used it. Edison didn't just sell inventions, he sold systems, infrastructure, and recurring electrical dependency. He was the godfather of the utility bill. If the modern tech subscription model had a grandfather, it would be Edison, hunched over a phonograph, muttering, "You want light? That'll be $1.25 a month. Plus tax." But what exactly is Edison's legacy? That's where it gets more complicated than a 19th century wiring diagram. On one hand, he was a visionary, a man who saw the future, sketched it on napkins, and then bullied it into existence. His work laid the groundwork for much of the 20th century. Home electricity, recorded music, cinema, telecommunication, and even the idea of research laboratories filled with specialists, rather than lone tinkerers in basements. He commercialized invention, industrialized innovation, and helped build the very idea of the modern inventor-entrepreneur. On the other hand, he was also kind of a jerk. He hoarded credit, steamrolled collaborators, and weaponized lawsuits like he was trying to win the Nobel Prize for pettiness. If someone else had a better idea, Edison's answer was rarely, "Let's collaborate." It was usually, "Let's litigate until they vanish." He once paid kids to beat up rival companies' light bulbs with sticks. That's not an urban legend. That's just peak Edison energy. Even his last years reflected this dual nature. He remained active in business and science, tinkering with storage batteries and rubber substitutes. He befriended Henry Ford, who basically turned their relationship into a PR campaign for industrial greatness. Ford even moved Edison's childhood home to his museum, complete with an exact replica of the Menlo Park lab, because nothing says legacy preservation like historical redecoration. At Edison's funeral, world leaders sent condolences, scientists paid tribute, and factories paused operations. Ford suggested everyone turn off their lights for 1 minute in Edison's honor. It was a beautiful gesture, although you can imagine Edison's ghost yelling, "Who's paying for that minute?" But here's the real kicker. Edison didn't just invent things, he invented how we remember invention. The image of the lone genius, the tinkerer, changing the world with a flash of inspiration. That's Edison's brand. Even if he had a full team of sleep-deprived lab assistants and an army of lawyers behind every idea, he made sure the public saw him as the glowing centerpiece. And now, almost a century later, we still live in the world he helped wire together. The outlets in our walls, the recorded music we stream, the movies we binge, the startup culture that worships productivity at the cost of sleep. Edison is in the DNA of it all. So was he a genius? Absolutely. Was he a thief? Also yes. Was he a monster? No, but he definitely flirted with villain energy during the off hours. Edison was half innovation, half intimidation, all brightly lit. He believed in the future, but only if he owned the copyright. He pushed humanity forward, sometimes dragging his rivals by the ankles. And while we celebrate his genius, we also now understand the cost of that progress. The people erased, the animals sacrificed, the ethics sidelined in pursuit of one more patent. In the end, Edison's legacy is like one of his early light bulbs, brilliant, a little unstable, and impossible to ignore. He helped light up the world, but maybe, just maybe, the real power came from everything he left in the shadows. The War of the Oaken Bucket, medieval Italy's most ridiculous war. Yes, it was over a bucket. If you've ever imagined medieval Italy as a land of rolling vineyards, operatic sunsets, and long-haired poets sighing over wine, well, yes, but also no, because behind that romantic postcard of the 14th century was a chaotic patchwork of city-states who were constantly one insult away from full-blown war. And the weapons of choice? Swords, spears, sarcasm, and occasionally a wooden bucket. But we'll get to that. First, let's set the stage. It's the early 1300s, and what we now know as Italy isn't a unified country. It's more like a collection of fiercely independent, occasionally murderous mini-republics, each run by local lords, merchant families, or whoever shouted the loudest in the town square last Tuesday. There's Florence, full of bankers and people wearing velvet, who somehow still found time to plot against their neighbors. Venice, rich from trade and perpetually damp. Milan, home to aggressive military ambitions and pointy helmets. And then there's our two star performers, Bologna and Modena, the medieval equivalent of two rival football teams who just can't let it go. Now you might think, okay, but they probably fought over important things, right? Like trade routes or royal successions. Oh, you sweet summer child. Sometimes, yes. But most of the time, these city-states went to war over things like territorial insults, unpaid dowries, or someone building a tower 1 meter taller than yours. In short, imagine Game of Thrones if everyone wore tights and yelled about cheese. These city-states formed alliances and rivalries so convoluted, they make soap operas look like IKEA instructions. One year, Florence and Siena were allies. The next year, Siena and Pisa were besties. Then Pisa burned Siena's olive groves, and Florence declared eternal vendetta. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope each had their favorite city-states, and those affiliations became the basis of Italy's two great political identities, the Guelphs, pro-Pope, and the Ghibellines, pro-Emperor. And these weren't just party names. Being a Guelph or a Ghibelline was like being sorted into Hogwarts houses, except instead of magic wands you had crossbows and boiling tar. Your family allegiance could determine where you lived, who you married, and whether your house got burned down in a pre-breakfast street riot. These factions caused cities to literally split in half, with barricades, rival councils, and dueling calendars. Yes, some cities couldn't even agree on what day it was. If you visited Italy in 1325 and asked someone, "Who's your enemy?" their answer might be, "My neighbor, my cousin," and whichever city insulted our fountain last week. Italian city-states were basically Renaissance high school cliques with catapults. Bologna was the overachieving honors student, home to one of the oldest universities in Europe, obsessed with law, Latin, and moral superiority. Modena, a scrappier, saltier neighbor with fewer books but more knives. You can already feel the tension. This constant political infighting was both ridiculous and weirdly productive. On one hand, you had cities torching each other over boundary stones. On the other hand, you had an explosion of culture, art, and architecture. Nothing motivates you to build a stunning cathedral quite like trying to outdo the people who burned your bakery last week. Oh, and let's not forget the mercenaries. Because of course there were mercenaries. If a city didn't have a standing army, and most didn't, they'd just hire one. Enter the condottieri, freelance warlords who sold their services to the highest bidder. These guys were part soldier, part businessman, and part Instagram influencer. If Instagram influencers wore steel armor and occasionally switched sides mid-battle because someone else paid better. So to recap, Italy in 1325 was a land of dueling egos, ever-shifting alliances, passionate vendettas, and about 15 different flags flying over towns that were sometimes only 5 miles apart. Everyone was armed, dramatic, and convinced their city had invented better pasta than yours. It's in this boiling cauldron of pride and parmesan that our story begins. The legendary, mind-boggling, somehow real War of the Oaken Bucket. Because when you mix centuries of tension with medieval machismo, and then someone steals a wooden pail, well, congratulations. You've just declared war. Let's set the scene. It's the year 1325. Tensions between Bologna and Modena have been simmering like a pot of medieval minestrone left unattended. Armies have clashed, borders have blurred, and egos have ballooned to catastrophic proportions. And then, somewhere in the depths of an already petty Cold War, a group of Modenese soldiers looked across enemy lines, pointed at a well, and said something along the lines of, "Let's steal their bucket." Yes, a bucket, not gold, not sacred relics, not even a hostage prince or a city charter. Just a simple wooden, iron-banded pail used to draw water. The kind of thing most households had, most soldiers ignored, and most people would never write a poem about. Unless, of course, you were from Modena, and stealing a bucket was suddenly your most profound political statement. According to local legend, and oh boy, is it legendary, a group of Modenese troops launched a quick surgical raid into enemy territory, like a special ops team in chainmail. Under cover of night, they slipped into Bologna, bypassed patrols, avoided detection, and found their target, a humble well. Now one could argue that stealing water during wartime made strategic sense. After all, water sources were as critical as food or fortifications. But no, these weren't thirsty soldiers. They didn't want the contents of the well, they wanted the hardware. So they lifted the bucket, unhooked it from the pulley, tucked it under an arm, and made a swift getaway. No casualties, no confrontation, just one highly successful petty theft, and a sprint back across enemy lines like mischievous teenagers who just ding-dong ditched the most powerful city in the region. The message was clear. Modena was here, and we're keeping your stuff. Honestly, if this had happened today, they would have uploaded a TikTok of the heist and added a dance challenge. Now, let's pause to appreciate just how deeply symbolic this act was. In medieval times, a city's well wasn't just plumbing. It was a public good, a civic necessity, a symbol of community stability. Stealing a well bucket was like unplugging your neighbor's Wi-Fi and declaring yourself king of the internet. Bologna took this as the ultimate insult. This wasn't just vandalism, this was theft of pride. Like Modena was saying, not only are we better than you, we can literally walk into your city, take something, and leave without so much as a scratch. And Bologna was furious. Their reaction was less ha-ha, those scamps, and more mobilize the army. Sound the horns, someone fetch the banner with extra dragons. To Modena, the stolen bucket was a trophy, a victory without bloodshed, a prank with political teeth. To Bologna, it was war. And the sad but hilarious part is that the Modenese might not have even planned it that way. It's entirely possible that what began as a whimsical middle finger became the spark for one of the most bizarre wars in Italian history. Upon returning to Modena, the soldiers presented the bucket like it was the Holy Grail. Civic leaders reportedly paraded it through town, hoisting it high, shouting gleefully like frat boys returning from a victorious paintball match. They displayed it proudly, not even trying to hide the evidence. In fact, the bucket wasn't just a trophy, it became a permanent exhibit. And in a city where war with Bologna was practically seasonal, this was a brilliant piece of morale boosting. It said, we don't just beat Bologna, we humiliate them with their own water-pulling devices. You can imagine the mayor of Modena standing in front of the town hall, bucket in hand, saying, fellow citizens, we now control the bucket. Bologna will weep into dry wells tonight. And the citizens cheering back, all hail the bucket. Here's where history turns from funny to farcical, because this bucket, this glorified wooden soup bowl, ignited one of the biggest military escalations in the region's recent memory. Bologna could not let it go, literally and figuratively. Diplomats were dispatched, messages were exchanged, threats were issued, return the bucket or face the consequences, they demanded. Modena's response, essentially, come and take it. Spoiler alert, they did try, with 30,000 troops. And so, what started as a minor act of nighttime trolling became a full-blown conflict, involving thousands of soldiers, destroyed villages, and a body count all sparked by the world's most controversial plumbing accessory. This, ladies and gentlemen, was the War of the Oaken Bucket, a conflict born not out of necessity, justice, or resource scarcity, but out of a well-timed act of trolling so effective, it would still be talked about centuries later, because nothing says, we take this too seriously, like declaring war over a bucket that wasn't even made of gold. There are meltdowns, and then there is what Bologna did after losing a bucket. Picture an entire city, home to scholars, nobles, and one of Europe's most prestigious universities, collectively snapping like a breadstick under pressure. Because when Modena refused to return the stolen well bucket, Bologna didn't just file a complaint or launch a dignified diplomatic protest. No, Bologna declared war with the subtlety of a medieval rock concert and the grace of a goat on roller skates. Let's put it bluntly, this was the historical equivalent of nuking a city because someone dinged your car. It started simply enough. Bologna sent word to Modena, return the bucket, now. Modena, possibly while sipping wine and petting their trophy bucket, responded with what can only be described as a diplomatic shrug. No apology, no negotiation, just a smug little no. That's when Bologna went full scorched earth mode. The city council gathered, robes flowing, brows furrowed. Scholars probably debated the legal ramifications, while someone else drew up military plans on parchment that still smelled like fresh ink. The decision, mobilize everyone. Because nothing says measured response like summoning an army of 30,000 troops to avenge a wooden container. Let's pause here. In medieval Italy, 30,000 men wasn't a light show of force. It was a city-emptying spectacle. Farmers, blacksmiths, students, and probably a few people who just came to watch the excitement, all herded into a war machine fueled by civic rage and bucket-based indignation. To put this in perspective, the population of Bologna at the time was around 50,000, 60,000. This means over half the city's able-bodied men marched to war over a glorified plumbing accessory. Armies in this era were not professional standing forces. They were messy, loud, disorganized mobs, bolstered by a few trained knights, and the occasional mercenary who knew which end of the spear to hold. The rest were conscripts, volunteers, and people who probably thought, maybe I'll get a free helmet out of this. Still, Bologna spared no expense. Banners were unfurled, armor was polished, horses were saddled. They even dragged siege equipment. Yes, siege equipment across the countryside to prepare for the glorious reclamation of a slightly damp wooden object. Their war cry may as well have been, "That's our bucket, and we'll kill for it." Now, to be fair, if we dare try, the bucket had become a symbol of national humiliation. Bologna wasn't just mad about losing a bucket. They were mad about losing face. To them, it was about sovereignty, pride, and the feeling of being mocked by a rival city-state that they already couldn't stand. But also, it was a bucket. It wasn't jewel-encrusted. It wasn't magical. It wasn't even particularly rare. Bologna had other buckets, probably dozens, but this bucket had been taken, and that made it personal. Imagine being a 14th century Bolognese peasant, handed a spear and told, "Your city needs you. We march at dawn." For what? A bucket. I have one at home. Not this one. As the army gathered, so did the excitement. Local taverns were abuzz. Poets composed verses about the righteous vengeance. Vendors sold meat pies, shaped like pails. Scholars attempted to justify the war with quotes from Cicero and Aristotle, conveniently ignoring the part where no philosopher ever advocated full-scale war over wooden cookware. The town crier probably yelled something like, hear ye, Modena has insulted the dignity of our well. Come one, come all, to restore honor and possibly loot something shiny." And the citizens answered, with boots, blades, and absolutely no sense of proportion. With the countryside trembling underfoot, the massive Bolognese army finally set off. They likely sang patriotic songs, carried flags emblazoned with their coat of arms, which, tragically, did not yet feature a bucket, and swore to return only in victory. If you were Modena at this point, you were either terrified or laughing so hard your armor rattled. Because yes, Modena had stolen a bucket, but now their enemies had launched what could only be described as the most over-the-top act of liquid container revenge in European history. This wasn't just military escalation, this was ego on parade, with swords. Bologna had taken a prank and turned it into a campaign. They weren't just coming to get their bucket back, they were coming to crush the city that had embarrassed them, prove a point, and possibly teach everyone else in Italy that stealing public water accessories had consequences. Unfortunately for Bologna, consequences were coming, but not the kind they expected. There's overkill, and then there's what Bologna did in late 1325, assembling one of the largest armies in northern Italy, sharpening blades, dusting off catapults, and fueling an entire logistical operation that would have made Julius Caesar say, "This feels a bit much." All of it, every boot step, every banner, every soup cauldron full of turnip stew, was aimed at one objective: retrieve a stolen wooden bucket from Modena. Tens of thousands of soldiers were on the move, each one probably asking the same thing under their breath. Wait, we're really doing this? To move an army of that size in the 14th century was no small feat. This wasn't like pressing a button and watching a line of tanks roll out. These were farmers turned fighters, students who still had homework due, blacksmiths who just wanted to finish shoeing one more horse, and nobles who now had to remember which end of the spear goes in the enemy. Gathering the men alone took days, some say weeks. Coordinating that many people without radios, trucks, or Google Maps was an exercise in chaotic optimism. You had a few flags, some guys on horses shouting directions, and a terrifying belief in the power of civic pride. And let's talk about the weapons. They didn't just bring swords, oh no. This was a full-blown display of military pageantry. Spears, axes, shields, siege towers, and possibly a battering ram nicknamed something dramatic like Bucketbane. There were wagons creaking under the weight of rocks, meant for catapults, spare pikes stacked like firewood, and food supplies that probably spoiled by day 2, all of it trudging across muddy roads in the name of liquid storage justice and the banners. Bologna made sure everyone, enemy, ally, and bewildered goat herder, knew they were coming. Richly coloured flags fluttered in the wind, stitched with noble symbols and family crests that looked very serious for people who were, again, about to fight over a bucket. Some soldiers painted slogans on their shields, others carved angry messages into their armour. If medieval social media existed, it would have been flooded with posts like #bucket our bust and Modena will pale. Morale was high, artificially so. You could almost hear the whispered doubts behind the marching songs. Do you think we'll actually fight? I heard Modena's army is smaller, but their archers aim for the eyes. What if we just take the bucket and run? Despite the absurdity of their cause, the army's movements were deadly serious. For the cities involved, this wasn't a joke. It was a demonstration, a show of power, an angry parade of sharpened iron and medieval spite. The mere act of moving this force across the region sent a message. Bologna was not to be messed with, not over land, not over trade, and definitely not over public water-holding accessories. Villages along the way must have had a surreal time watching 30,000 armed men stomp past their fields. One moment, you're picking cabbages. The next, you're saluting a marching column of men with banners flapping and drums pounding, all because someone stole a bucket. It's likely that at least a few peasants stared in silence, then muttered, "I'm too sober for this," and went back to their turnips. The logistical nightmare didn't end with just walking. Feeding the army was its own ridiculous challenge. Soldiers needed bread, meat, dried fruit, barrels of wine because hydration was a myth, and whatever else they could raid along the way. Cooks worked with what they had: lentils, boiled grain, and questionable cheese that doubled as a weapon in close combat. Meanwhile, officers rode up and down the lines on horseback, trying to keep order among a crowd that ranged from hardened knights to 14-year-olds with pointy sticks and too much confidence. And as this human tide crawled toward Modena, what did the Modenese do? They watched and laughed. From their towers, they likely spotted the banners from miles away. Their scouts reported that yes, the Bolognese were bringing everyone, and yes, they were completely serious about it. Modena's leadership probably held an emergency meeting with 2 items on the agenda. 1, how to survive the siege, and 2, how to forever memorialize the moment their neighbor lost its mind over a wooden cylinder. But for Bologna, this wasn't madness. This was righteous fury in chainmail form. This was about honor, reputation, and sending a message to the rest of Italy. Mess with Bologna's buckets, and you get the whole wrath of God package. Whether they won or not didn't matter in the moment. They were already convinced the sheer size of their army was a victory in itself. Of course, what happened next would decide just how far petty pride could carry a city, and how much egg, possibly paired with tomato and regret, would end up on Bologna's face. November 15th, 1325. The fog settled thick over the hills of Zappolino, like nature itself wanted to cover its eyes in embarrassment, because what happened next was the military equivalent of a pie in the face, delivered with the full power of divine irony. Bologna, with its grand army of roughly 30,000 strong, banners waving and swords glinting, finally squared off against Modena, whose troops barely cracked 7,000. The math alone looked like a done deal. You'd expect a swift and humiliating defeat for Modena, but instead, Modena didn't just win. They flattened Bologna with such flair that historians still wince on Bologna's behalf. This wasn't just a loss, it was a trampling by a smaller, faster, meaner army that had something Bologna's did not: strategic competence, mobility, and the kind of feral energy you only get when defending your city's stolen bucket. Let's rewind to the battlefield. Bologna's army was bloated, not with muscle, but with numbers, bureaucracy, and the misplaced confidence of a city that thought victory was guaranteed simply by showing up. Their troops included university students, untrained militia, and townsfolk more familiar with quill pens than killing pikes. Their chainmail didn't match, their formations were shaky, and the terrain, wet, muddy, and hilly, not exactly ideal for hauling siege towers and moral superiority. Meanwhile, Modena's soldiers were lean, experienced, and intimately familiar with the local geography. This was their turf. These were their hills. They didn't need to guess where the enemy might falter. They knew exactly which slope would turn into a mudslide, under 30,000 poorly coordinated boots. As Bologna advanced, things began to unravel fast. Their supply lines lagged, orders got lost. People slipped in the mud, horses panicked. At one point, some accounts suggest parts of the army got tangled trying to reposition. A medieval version of "Why are we all standing in the same place and yelling?" And then Modena struck, hard, with agility and surprise on their side. They launched an aggressive assault that pierced the bloated Bolognese line like a spear through wet bread. Their archers let fly a volley so sharp and coordinated, it sent tremors through the larger force. Their cavalry came in fast, slicing through confusion and morale with surgical precision. It wasn't just a battle, it was a clinic. Bolognese tried to regroup, but their massive numbers worked against them, like trying to turn a whale in a bathtub. Every attempt to realign the army just created more chaos. Men were pushed into ditches, officers lost control. By mid-battle, the Bolognese were not fighting, they were fleeing, and the cherry on top, according to legend, the fleeing soldiers were pursued all the way back to the gates of Bologna, where they slammed the doors shut behind them in sheer panic. Some were said to have thrown down their weapons entirely, using speed over steel to survive the humiliation. Meanwhile, Modena wasn't done being petty. After chasing their rivals off the field, they reportedly took a victory lap, raiding and pillaging Bologna's countryside, burning crops, and flattening outposts as if to say, "Let this be a lesson, never mess with a city that guards its buckets like sacred relics." At this point, the scorecard read, Modena, 1 and 1 bucket, Bologna, 0 plus several thousand bruised egos. The magnitude of the embarrassment cannot be overstated. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a diplomatic disaster, a morale implosion, and a masterclass in underestimating your enemy while dramatically overestimating your cause. Bologna's giant army, built to deliver bucket vengeance, had instead written itself into the How Not to Win a War textbook. You can almost imagine the Modenese commander standing over the battlefield, muddy and grinning, whispering, "All that, for a bucket," before ordering his men to carry their wooden trophy even higher, because yes, they still had it. If anything, the battle had elevated the bucket to mythological status. What had once been a cheeky heist was now a symbol of defiance, victory, and very, very precise pettiness. Modena didn't just defend their city, they defended their honor by defending their bucket. And Bologna had no choice but to crawl back home and consider how a vastly superior force could lose so thoroughly to an opponent whose entire war budget may have included, at most, one working catapult and some really determined dudes with spears. From that day on, Zappolino became a name carved in Modena's collective smugness and Bologna's historical hangover. There's defeat, and then there's whatever Bologna did after Zappolino. Imagine organizing one of the largest armies in your city's history, marching across the countryside with war drums and theatrical speeches, only to turn tail and run home faster than a goose dodging a butcher. The Battle of Zappolino didn't just end with Modena winning, it ended with Bologna sprinting into the kind of retreat that future historians would describe using phrases like ungraceful backpedal and logistically catastrophic flail. After being routed by a Modenese force less than a quarter their size, Bologna's once proud war machine devolved into an uncoordinated stampede of mud-covered regrets. Horses trampled overfoot. Commanders shouted contradictory orders. Some soldiers in full armor dove into ditches to hide from arrows that had stopped flying 20 minutes ago. A few allegedly tried to blend in with trees, proving that even in medieval times, denial was a popular coping strategy. Modena, meanwhile, was having the time of its life. They didn't just win, they decided to chase Bologna all the way home, just to make sure no one, especially not Bologna, forgot who came out on top. This wasn't a strategic pursuit, this was a victory lap, soaked in vengeance. Modenese cavalry rode behind the retreating army, heckling them in what must have been the most smug Italian dialect imaginable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of honking while someone makes a 3-point turn too slowly, except everyone's armed, on horseback, and screaming about buckets. As Bologna's men stumbled back toward their gates, panic set in. The city scrambled to receive what was left of its army. Picture the moment. Guards atop the walls spotting a cloud of dust on the horizon, preparing for reinforcements, only to realize that it was their army, and they were coming home backwards. No cheers, no trumpets, just thousands of humiliated troops limping in, dragging broken spears and dignity, looking like they'd lost a duel with a rake. And Modena, they didn't stop at the psychological torment. No, they decided to deliver a final plumbing-based insult that Bologna wouldn't forget anytime soon. Enter the aqueduct. This stone marvel brought fresh water to Bologna, a practical and precious part of city life. It represented stability, civilization, and the refreshing feeling of not drinking from a questionable puddle. And Modena, in a fit of beautifully spiteful genius, decided to knock it down. They didn't just break it, they celebrated it. Tearing apart the aqueduct was Modena's way of saying, "Here's your consolation prize, thirst." It was a calculated act of medieval trolling. Bologna lost a battle, and its plumbing in the same week. That's a rough Monday. Now, why the aqueduct? Because you can't unsteal a bucket. But you can make sure the city you took it from can't fill another one anytime soon. The symbolism was chef's kiss. Bologna had gone to war over a stolen water pail, and came back without a functioning water supply. Modena didn't just defeat them, they rewrote the rules of petty warfare. Most victors would take prisoners or treasure. Modena took hydration. Bologna's government tried to maintain composure. Of course, statements were probably issued, spinning the retreat as a temporary strategic redeployment, and blaming the loss on unexpected weather, tricky terrain, and enemy sneakiness. But no one was buying it. The people saw what happened. They smelled their own unwashed soldiers returning, and they definitely noticed when they turned on the public fountains and got dust. Meanwhile, Modena paraded around with their bucket, still proudly displayed like the Holy Grail in a town that had weaponized mockery. Stories of the battle and the retreat spread across Italy like wildfire. Other city-states probably used it as a cautionary tale. Don't bring 30,000 men to a bucket fight if you don't know what you're doing. And the soldiers of Bologna, they returned home, humiliated and parched, to face family members who had questions. You went to war for a bucket, you lost. We're out of water, by the way. It became a civic scar, one that no amount of parchment, poetry, or papal blessings could really erase. Because while most wars are remembered for their grand stakes and sweeping consequences, this one was remembered for what it cost: pride, plumbing, and a big wooden bowl on a rope. Victory parades are typically reserved for returning heroes, royal weddings, or at the very least, moments when your entire city doesn't look like it just got done hazing its larger neighbour. But Modena, oh Modena, threw a party. And not just any celebration. This was a full-blown medieval block party, complete with cheering crowds, smug knights, and the star of the show, a wooden bucket. Let's be clear, this wasn't your average firewood-carrying, goat-watering utility pail. This was the bucket. The bucket that had survived a covert heist, sparked a city-wide tantrum, launched a military invasion, and emerged as the unlikely MVP of a national grudge match. So when Modena brought it home, they didn't just toss it in a closet. No, they gave it the full red carpet treatment. Picture the moment. A Modenese procession winding through narrow cobbled streets, trumpets blaring, flags flying, people tossing flower petals, and in the middle of it all, a soldier holding a wooden bucket aloft, like it was forged from unicorn horn. Children screamed with joy. Elderly citizens wept. At least one town crier nearly passed out from yelling, "Behold the bucket," 50 times in a row. Because this wasn't just about a thing. This was about winning. This was about a city punching up, punching hard, and walking away with its opponent's lunch and bragging rights. Modena had gone toe-to-toe with a larger, richer, allegedly smarter rival. And not only did they win, but they kept a souvenir that would make Bologna grind its teeth for centuries. Once the parade was over and the cheering died down, the next question was obvious. Where do you keep a national treasure made of wood and petty vengeance? Answer: in the Torre della Ghirlandina. That's Modena's main civic tower. Part bell tower, part pride monument, part medieval flex. They didn't hide the bucket in some dusty storeroom. They placed it high up, like a relic, like something you'd pray to for rain or revenge. It wasn't just on display, it was enshrined, and it's still there. To this day, yes, over 700 years later, that bucket remains perched in Modena, like a giant wooden mic drop. Historians, tourists, and confused onlookers have stared up at it for centuries, wondering how a small wooden vessel could become the most glorified piece of kindling in Italian history. Imagine if your neighbor stole your flower pot, beat you in a street fight, and then mounted it above their fireplace for generations, while inviting friends over just to point and laugh. That's what Modena did. They didn't just win the war, they curated it, and it worked. The bucket became a symbol of city pride. Children grew up learning the tale, songs were sung, poetry was written, somewhere in a candlelit room. A scribe probably penned something wildly overwrought like, "O sacred pail, thou vessel of Modena's wrath," and no one laughed, because they meant it. Bologna, meanwhile, had to live with the fact that their greatest humiliation was immortalized in the most public way possible. Every time a merchant visited Modena, every time a papal messenger passed through, every time a bored teenager wandered the city center and looked up, there it was, the bucket, a constant reminder that Modena didn't just win the battle, they won the narrative. In an age where relics of saints and slivers of the true cross were treasured, Modena chose a splintered piece of municipal furniture and said, "This is ours, this is sacred, and no, you can't have it back." And Bologna, well, they stopped asking for it. After the embarrassment of Zappolino, the national plumbing sabotage, and the wild retreat, there was simply no dignified way to request a bucket's return. What could they say? "Hey, can we talk about the thing you stole that ruined our entire year, and also our aqueduct?" Not likely. Instead, the bucket stayed. It became part of local law, a warning, a trophy, a reminder that sometimes in history, it's not about the resources or the army or the noble cause. Sometimes it's about having the audacity to steal something small and then double down with maximum theatrics. Modena understood this on a cellular level. They turned a minor theft into a legacy. They turned a water container into a cultural icon, and they threw a party for it like they'd won the medieval Super Bowl. Because frankly, they had. Looking back on medieval history, there's plenty to shake your head at: witch trials, leech-based medicine, the time someone declared war over a pig. But even in that proud tradition of overreaction, the War of the Oaken Bucket has managed to earn itself a special crown of seriously among historians. Because, out of all the reasons to mobilize thousands of men, wreck the countryside, and topple aqueducts, this might be the most impressively stupid: a bucket. A literal, wooden, dirt-holding, water-dipping bucket. Let's be clear, this wasn't a gold-plated, jewel-encrusted ceremonial artifact, blessed by a pope. It was just a bucket, and even that term might be generous. By most descriptions, it was standard issue, basic wood slats, iron hoops, probably smelled vaguely of mildew. And yet, this sad little cylinder became the focus of full-blown war, not a skirmish, not a border raid, but a named conflict, one that historians still write books about, mostly while chuckling. Modern historians, tasked with sorting through centuries of battles over religion, land, or dynastic drama, frequently return to the War of the Oaken Bucket as a kind of academic palate cleanser. After all, when you're buried in the grim reality of the 30 Years' War or the Crusades, it's comforting, if mildly horrifying, to remember that Italy once threw down 37,000 men over a glorified soup bowl. And while it's easy to laugh now, it wasn't some harmless food fight. People died. Cities were pillaged. Farms were torched. Infrastructure was destroyed. All because Modena's version of a prank involved a wooden bucket, and Bologna's version of diplomacy involved yelling, "This means war," at the top of their lungs. As one medieval historian put it bluntly, this was the most violent case of finders keepers in history. It's not that medieval people were dumb, they were just exceptionally committed to pettiness. In a world where honor was everything, being embarrassed by a rival city wasn't just a bruise, it was a political crisis. Bologna couldn't let Modena get away with public mockery, and Modena, they couldn't resist the opportunity to turn the knife. What makes this whole thing even more ridiculous is that this wasn't an isolated outburst in a peaceful time. Italy during the 14th century was basically a permanent bar fight with frescoes. City-states were already on edge. Alliances were shifting faster than a middle school lunch table, and everyone was armed to the teeth. So yes, the bucket was the spark, but the fuel had been building for years. Still, when you stack the War of the Oaken Bucket next to other causes of war, succession crises, assassinated archdukes, imperial expansion, it reads like a joke that got way out of hand. One historian described it as a Monty Python sketch with real bloodshed. Another simply titled their article, When diplomacy fails, the bucket incident, and the aftermath, oh, it just makes things worse. Modena never gave the bucket back. They displayed it. They paraded it. They bragged about it. For generations. It was, and remains, the world's pettiest trophy. Historians have had 7 centuries to reflect on that fact, and it still makes the top 5 lists of most absurd wars ever fought. The lesson here? Well, one takeaway is that human pride is a deeply irrational force. We've gone to war over cattle, flags, shoes, even insults about mustaches. But this one, this humble, splintering bucket, symbolizes the purest form of escalation, the kind where no one wins, everyone suffers, and someone ends up putting their plumbing on display. Even now, scientists sometimes use the War of the Oaken Bucket as a case study in escalation psychology. It starts with a provocation, is followed by a refusal to back down, and ends in mutual destruction with a side of tragicomedy. You can map the behavior directly onto modern situations, though thankfully, most don't involve agricultural equipment. And then there's the tourist angle. Modern Modena still proudly exhibits the bucket like it's the crown jewels. Visitors stare up at it, listen to the story, and laugh, because it is funny. It's also a little sobering. We like to think of history as grand and noble, but sometimes it's just 2 cities throwing punches over a piece of old kitchenware and refusing to apologize. To quote one scholar, "When your national ego is smaller than your wooden bucket, it's time to re-evaluate your foreign policy." Walk into the heart of Modena today, this charming cobblestone city, full of Baroque beauty, opera houses, balsamic vinegar, and Ferraris, and you'll find a relic that doesn't quite match the rest of the grandeur. It's not a statue of a saint, it's not a Roman ruin, it's not even a particularly ornate artifact. It's a bucket. More specifically, it's the bucket. The same glorified piece of medieval plumbing that somehow ignited a full-scale war back in 1325, proudly housed in the Torre della Ghirlandina. Modena's iconic civic tower, the oaken pail is perched like a holy relic, and after centuries of drama, bloodshed, vandalism, revenge parades, and high-level historic pettiness, it still sits there, unapologetically wooden, unimpressively shaped, and completely legendary. You can visit it. People do visit it. Tourists from all over the world come to Modena, eat some tortellini, maybe catch an opera, and then climb the tower to look at a wooden container that once made Bologna cry itself to sleep. It's not fancy, it's not golden, it doesn't sparkle. If anything, it looks like something you'd find behind a barn and politely ignore. But context is everything. Some countries have crown jewels, others have ancient thrones or battle-worn swords. Modena has a bucket so emotionally charged, it could still start family arguments if discussed at the dinner table. And that's the brilliance of it. The bucket is more than a souvenir. It's a symbol of a moment in time when human stubbornness reached its comedic peak, got drunk on honor, and marched 30,000 people into a war that ended with broken aqueducts and eternal bragging rights. Even the display itself is a masterstroke of Modenese trolling. The bucket isn't tucked away in a museum. It isn't stored under glass with a plaque whispering solemn facts. It's right out there in public, in a city tower, visible to anyone who dares ask, "Wait, is that really the bucket?" And the answer is yes. That's it. The real MVP of petty medieval warfare. Over the centuries, it has aged like fine wine. And by that we mean it's become a meme wrapped in historical reverence. Schools still teach the story, locals still chuckle about it, tour guides tell the tale with pride, and every now and then, someone from Bologna probably walks past it and mutters something salty under their breath. The bucket has earned its place in the pantheon of absurd history. In fact, it's become so symbolic of overreaction that it often shows up in discussions about diplomatic failures, ridiculous battles, or just general human nonsense. It's referenced in essays, books, podcasts, and memes. Yes, actual memes. There's a whole corner of the internet where history lovers have photoshopped the bucket onto Mount Rushmore, given it its own coat of arms, and imagined what it would say if it could talk. Spoiler, it's very smug. It's not just a war relic, it's a cultural touchstone, a reminder that sometimes humans will go to absurd lengths to prove a point, that even rational societies can unravel when pride is on the line, that national identity can hinge not on castles or cathedrals, but on one very inconvenient piece of firewood. And maybe, just maybe, that's part of the charm, because when we look back at history, we often find the tragedy, the injustice, the violence, but every now and then, there's a story like this, where no great empires rose or fell, where no kingdoms collapsed, where the only real monument left is a bucket and the message it accidentally carved into history. People are ridiculous, gloriously, hopelessly, hilariously ridiculous. So if you're ever in Modena, climb the steps of the Ghirlandina, stand in front of the bucket. Take a moment, let the absurdity wash over you, and remember, entire cities once clashed over this thing. Lives were lost, walls were breached, plumbing was destroyed, all for a humble container that couldn't even hold enough water to quench a night's thirst. And yet, it endured, not because it was precious, but because it was the perfect symbol of how seriously humans can take the unserious, which, when you think about it, is kind of beautiful, or at least beautifully dumb.